Hey there and welcome back. Tonight we are going to spend the evening with a single family and we are going to watch them climb across 500 years from a muddy sheep pasture in the English Midlands to the very steps of the throne. It is a story of wool and money and land, of clever marriages and lucky deaths, of a house that grew and grew until it held one of the finest private collections in Europe, and of the men and women who lived inside it, some of them brilliant, some of them foolish, one or two of them very nearly great. They began as farmers who understood sheep better than their neighbours did. They ended as one of the most famous families in the world, and I will tell you now where all of it is going to end, though not yet how nor why. It ends on a small wooded island in the middle of a lake in the park of the house we are walking towards, where a woman is buried whom millions once believed they knew. Nobody is permitted to set foot there. And the whole of that, the island and the silence and the flowers left on the far shore, grew out of grass and rain and the patient counting of animals on a hillside in Warwickshire. Before we walk back into those centuries, let me say the quiet word I always like to say to you. If these long journeys into the past are a comfort, a way of setting the day down and letting the mind go still, then you would be very welcome to travel with me again on the other evenings I have set down, for there are a good many of them waiting, other lives and other centuries to slip away into whenever you would like them. There is nothing at all you need to do. Only come along if it suits you. And I always love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, whether the evening is only just drawing in, or whether it is the small deep middle of the night. So if you should ever care to leave me a few words about it, I look through them with real pleasure, and I find something lovely in the thought of so many of us, scattered so widely, gathering quietly together in the same old vanished centuries. Picture this. It is a late afternoon in autumn, and you are coming up a long straight avenue of lime trees in Northamptonshire, and the light is going amber and low across the parkland on either side. Ahead of you, at the end of the avenue, a house is standing in the last of the sun, a wide calm front of pale brick and stone, tall windows catching the light, chimneys standing up dark against a sky going pink at the edges. There is water somewhere to the left, a lake with an island in it, still as glass deer are moving in the park. The house is called Althorp, and it has stood on this ground, in one shape or another, for 500 years, and one family has lived in it that whole time, father to son, generation upon generation, watching the centuries go by from behind those windows. Tonight, we are going to walk in. To understand how the Spencers rose, you must first understand sheep, and I know that sounds an unpromising way to begin the story of a family that would one day marry into the royal house of England. But it is the truth of it, and it is a better truth than most families can claim, because the Spencers did not rise by the sword, and they did not rise by conquest, and they did not rise by the accident of royal blood. They rose because they were very good indeed at a particular kind of farming, at a moment in English history when that particular kind of farming was the surest way in the kingdom to turn labour into money. Consider what England was in the closing years of the 15th century. It was a country of about 2.5 million souls, most of them scratching a living from the soil, and its one great export, the thing the rest of Europe wanted and would pay handsomely for, was wool. English wool was the finest in the known world, long stapled and strong and soft, and the weavers of Flanders and Florence and the Low Countries could not get enough of it. The raw fleeces went out of the eastern ports by the shipload, and the money came back, and the men who owned the sheep grew rich. Not gentry rich, not at first, merchant rich, solid, unglamorous, accumulating, the sort of wealth that is counted rather than displayed. And the country that grew the sheep best was the belt of Midland England, the rolling pasture of Warwickshire and Northamptonshire, where the grass was sweet, and the land lay open, and the vast flocks could be moved across it season by season. Here, in these green, undramatic counties, a class of men was emerging whom their contemporaries called graziers, which is to say men who did not grow crops but kept beasts, who fattened cattle and above all who ran sheep, in flocks that could number in the thousands. It was a business of scale and patience and hard-headed judgment. A grazier needed to know his pasture and his water and his weather, to know when to buy and when to sell, to know the difference between a good fleece and an indifferent one at a glance, and to keep in his head the running arithmetic of 100 small decisions upon which the year's profit hung. The Spencers in these years were graziers, and by every sign they were exceptionally good ones. They came out of Warwickshire, from around the villages of Snitterfield and Wormleighton, and the family had been there for generations, quietly prospering, quietly buying, quietly extending its pastures. They were not nobody. They were the sort of prosperous farming family that the villages knew and respected, whose name appeared on the manor rolls, who paid their tithes and sat in the front pews and married the daughters of other prosperous farming families. But they were not gentlemen. No coat of arms hung over their door. No king had ever heard of them. In the elaborate ladder of English rank, they stood well below the lowest rung that mattered, and the distance between a rich sheep farmer and a knight of the shire was in that age an almost unbridgeable social gulf. What the Spencers had, though, was the thing that in the long run mattered more than birth, and that was capital and the sense to know what to do with it. Every year the fleeces went to market. Every year the money came in. And each season, instead of spending it, they bought more land and put more sheep on it, and the flocks grew, and the pastures spread across the Midland shires, until by the last decades of the 15th century, the family was running one of the greatest sheep operations in England. They were in the language of a later age, in the middle of a boom, and they were positioned to catch every penny of it. Wool prices held. The demand from the continent held. The grass grew. And in the counting houses of the Spencer farms, the money piled up quietly, year upon patient year. There is a moment, in the rise of any family that rises, when accumulated money must be turned into something else, because money alone confers nothing in a hierarchical society. It buys comfort, but it does not buy standing, and standing is what such families crave, generation after generation, with a hunger that outlives the men who feel it. To be respectable was not enough. To be rich was not enough. What was wanted was land, held in one's own right, and a house upon it worth the name, and after those two things, in the fullness of time, a title, and then perhaps a place at court, and then, at the very summit, the ear of the king. That was the ladder, and any ambitious English family of the age knew its rungs by heart, and the Spencers, with their fleece money heaped up behind them, were about to set their foot upon the first of them. And they were about to do it at the perfect moment. The long agony of the civil wars that we call the Wars of the Roses had exhausted the old nobility, killing off its sons in battle and its fathers on the block, breaking up ancient estates and scattering ancient fortunes. A new dynasty, the Tudors, had come to the throne, and they were suspicious of the grand magnates who had made and unmade kings, and inclined to raise up new men, loyal men, men who owed everything to the crown, and had no dangerous cousins of their own. The land market was wide open. The old families were selling, and there, with money in hand and an eye for a bargain, stood a Warwickshire sheep farmer named John Spencer. The trade itself was organised with a thoroughness that would surprise anyone who imagines the medieval economy as a muddle. English wool did not simply drift abroad. It went through what was called the staple, a system by which the Crown compelled the export trade to pass through a single appointed town, for many years the port of Calais, then held by England, where the wool was inspected and weighed and taxed before it went on to the looms of Flanders. The customs on wool were, for 2 centuries, the largest single source of revenue the English crown possessed, which is to say that English kings fought their French wars on sheep. Everyone in the chain understood this, from the monarch in Westminster down to the grazier on his Midland hillside, and the grazier understood too that so long as the looms of the continent kept turning, his fleeces would be wanted, and his money would be safe. And there is one more thing about wool that made it the perfect foundation for a dynasty, which is that it is patient. A crop must be sown and reaped within the year, and if the harvest fails, the year is lost. A flock does not fail in that way. It walks about the hillside, converting grass into money at a steady rate, and it reproduces itself, and a bad season means a thinner fleece rather than nothing at all. A man with 10,000 sheep has a machine that runs on rain. He can plan across decades, he can borrow against next season with confidence, and he can pass the whole apparatus to his son intact, which a merchant with ships at sea, or a courtier with a royal pension, most emphatically cannot. We will come to him properly in a moment, and to the 2 purchases he made, 4 years apart, that would decide the fortunes of his descendants for the next half a millennium. But before we do, hold in your mind the picture of what these people actually were, before their greatness, because the whole meaning of the story depends upon it. Picture the wide Midland pasture under a grey sky. Picture the flocks moving across it, and the shepherds with their dogs, and the men on horseback riding out at dawn to see how the lambing has gone. Picture the wool sacks stacked in the barn, and the merchants coming from London to look them over, and the slow, careful haggling that would fix a season's profit. There is nothing romantic in it, and nothing noble. It is farming, and hard work, and the counting of coins, and out of it, out of the grass and the rain and the sheep, would come earls and duchesses and a princess, and a house full of Van Dykes. It is one of the strangest ascents in English history, and it began exactly here, and it is to its first great step and the buying of Althorp that we turn next. The man who made the Spencers was named John, and he was, as far as we can tell, exactly the sort of person you would expect to make a family's fortune, and exactly the sort of person nobody writes poems about. He was shrewd, he was patient, he was ruthless in a quiet, legal way, and he had spent his life in the business of sheep. He was already a rich man when he began to buy. What he did with his riches in the first decade of the 16th century was to convert them, deliberately and permanently, into the one asset that in England conferred not merely wealth but position, and that asset was land. In the year 1506, he purchased the manor of Wormleighton in Warwickshire, the country his family already knew, and he set about enclosing it. 2 years later, in 1508, he bought a second property over the county border in Northamptonshire, a manor with a name that was then spelled and pronounced in a dozen different ways and that we now call Althorp. He bought it from a family called Catesby, who were selling because they needed money, as old families so often did. And with those 2 purchases, made 4 years apart by a farmer with wool money in his purse, the whole subsequent history of the Spencers was set in motion. Wormleighton would eventually pass out of the story. Althorp would remain, held by his descendants in an unbroken line down to the present day, for more than 500 years. It is worth pausing on what he bought. Althorp in those days was not the calm classical house you saw at the end of the avenue. It was a moated manor, older and rougher, standing among fields, a working property rather than a showpiece. The land around it was good grazing, which was of course precisely why John Spencer wanted it, and he promptly put his sheep upon it, thousands of them, and ran the estate as what it was, a highly profitable pastoral business. Under its earliest Spencer masters, Althorp was a farm, but he did not leave it a farm, and here we see the shape of the family's whole ambition already forming. Almost at once he began to build, replacing the old manor with something grander, a proper gentleman's house in brick, with a courtyard and a gatehouse, fit for a man who intended to be received as a gentleman. And he began, too, the other kind of building, the kind that goes on in the minds of neighbours. He served as a sheriff. He sat as a justice. He performed the local offices by which a man of substance became, gradually, a man of standing. And in 1519 King Henry VIII knighted him, and the sheep farmer's son became Sir John Spencer, and the family stepped across the invisible line that separated the merely rich from the gentry of England. We should be honest about how that money was made, because the process by which the graziers grew rich carried a real human cost, and it was bitterly resented in its own time. It was called enclosure. In the old medieval system, much of the arable land of a village lay in open fields, farmed in strips by the villagers, with common land beside it where the poor might graze a cow or gather fuel. Enclosure meant taking that land, hedging it, and turning it over to pasture, because pasture with sheep on it made far more money for the landlord than corn grown by peasants. It also meant that the peasants were no longer needed. A field of wheat requires many hands. A field of sheep requires a shepherd and a dog. So across the Midlands, through the last decades of the 15th century and the first of the 16th, villages emptied, and cottages fell in, and families walked away from land. Their people had worked for 300 years. Sometimes whole hamlets simply disappeared, their houses pulled down, their fields laid to grass, until nothing was left but the humps and hollows in the turf that you can still see from the air today. Our contemporaries raged about it. Preachers thundered from pulpits. Thomas More wrote the famous bitter line that in England the sheep were eating the men. Commissions of inquiry were appointed, and the Spencers, along with many other graziers, were called before them and required to answer for the villages they had turned to pasture. And then they answered, and they went on. Sir John defended himself with the argument the graziers always used, that the land had been poor arable and was better as grass, that he had not depopulated but improved, and there was some truth in it, and a good deal of self-interest. The commissions came and went. The fines, where they were levied, were affordable. The flock stayed, and the money kept coming in, and the family kept climbing, and beneath the climb, unremembered, lay the emptied villages and the walked-away families whose names nobody wrote down. That is how great houses are built, more often than the mighty houses like to remember, and Althorp is no different from 100 others in this. The lime avenue and the deer park and the pictures on the walls all rest, at the bottom, on grass that had once been someone else's ploughland. There is an irony buried in that purchase which is worth turning over. The family from whom John Spencer bought Althorp were called Catesby, and they were an old Catholic gentry family in decline, selling their manors piecemeal to pay their way. A century later, a descendant of theirs, Robert Catesby, having lost most of what remained, and having lost his faith's place in England besides, would gather a dozen men in a room and plan to blow up the king and the lords and the commons with barrels of gunpowder beneath the palace of Westminster. He was the leader of that plot, not the man in the cellar whose name we remember. And so the land that made the Spencers had been sold to them by the family of the man who nearly destroyed the English state, and the money that bought it came from sheep. It is worth saying what a Tudor sheep run actually looked like, since it is the engine beneath everything that follows. The flock did not stand in one field. It moved in a great slow annual circuit from the winter pastures to the lambing grounds to the summer grass, tended by shepherds who lived out with the animals in temporary huts, who knew every ewe by sight, and who slept beside the fold at lambing to keep the foxes off. Shearing came at midsummer, and the whole countryside turned out for it, and the clipped fleeces were rolled and tied and stacked in the wool barn, and the buyers came riding from the towns. Every stage of it was labour, and none of it was mechanical, and it produced, from nothing but grass and rain and the patience of men, a river of money. Sir John's building at Althorp has almost entirely vanished beneath what came after, and yet its shape survives, in the way the bones of an old body survive beneath the clothes. The house you see is still, at its core, a Tudor courtyard house, a hollow square built about an open middle, with the hall on one side and the kitchens on another. Later generations roofed the courtyard and turned it into a great central staircase hall. They pushed out wings and refaced the whole. But if you could strip the grey tiles and the classical detail away, you would find a 16th century merchant's fortress underneath, built by a man who wanted the world to know that he had arrived. Sir John Spencer died in 1522, and he left behind him something remarkable. He left a knighthood, and 2 great estates, and an enormous flock, and a house that was becoming a seat, and above all, he left a direction, a settled family understanding of what the Spencers were now trying to be. His descendants would not be farmers. They would be gentry, and then they would be nobility, and then, if fortune held and the marriages were made cleverly enough, they would be something more than that. Not one of them, for the next 15 generations, would seriously deviate from that project. It is one of the most single-minded family ascents in English history, and the extraordinary thing is how patient it was, how content each generation was to move the family forward by only a little, trusting the next to carry it further. And it is to those patient Tudor generations, and to the marriages by which they climbed, that we turn next. The century that followed Sir John's death is, in the Spencer story, a long quiet stretch of consolidation, and it is easy to hurry past it, because nothing very dramatic happens. No one of them is beheaded. No one of them leads an army. While the Tudor court convulses itself with the vast matter of King Henry's marriages, and the monasteries come down, and the faith of England swings from Rome to Canterbury and back again, and Queen Mary lights her fires and Queen Elizabeth walks her long careful tightrope, the Spencers of Althorp are at home, in Northamptonshire, minding their business. And their business in this period is threefold. Keep the sheep, buy the land, marry the daughters upward. Of these 3, the third was the most important, and it is the one thing that the family did, generation after generation, with an unerring instinct. Marriage in that age was the grand instrument of social mobility, the one respectable way for money to purchase blood. A rising family with cash could offer a portion, a dowry, to a declining family with lineage, and both parties got what they wanted, the old name receiving the new money, and the new money receiving the old name. The children of such a marriage carried both, and so, patiently, methodically, across 4 or 5 generations, the Spencers married their sons to the daughters of families a little grander than themselves, and their own daughters into families grander still, and each match pulled the whole clan a rung or 2 upward. Watch how it works. Sir John's heir marries into an established gentry family. The next generation marries into a family with connections at court. The next marries a knight's daughter whose mother was a peer's sister. Each time the money is the bait, and the name is what improves. By the reign of Elizabeth they are related, by a widening cat's cradle of cousinhood, to a wide fraction of the English aristocracy, and their daughters are being sought as brides in circles that would not have received their great-grandfather at all. In one generation their girls marry into 3 separate noble houses. The sheep farmer's blood is entering the peerage, and the money was extraordinary, because the flocks had never stopped, and the land had never stopped being bought, and where other families spent their fortunes on faction and display and the ruinous business of following the court, the Spencers had spent theirs on more grass. By the middle of the 16th century they were among the very richest untitled families in England, and possibly among the richest families of any rank. Contemporaries noticed. There is a persistent thread of comment, running through the Elizabethan period. About the astonishing wealth of these Northamptonshire graziers, said in one report to be running as many as 20,000 sheep. 20,000. It is a number that stops you, if you try to see it, a white tide moving across half a county. Meanwhile the house grew. Each generation added to Althorp, extending, improving, making it fitter for the family that the Spencers were becoming. The moat was filled in, courtyards were enclosed, the rough Tudor manor thickened into something like a mansion, and around it the park was laid out, and the trees planted, whose descendants line the approach today. And inside the family began to buy pictures, and plate, and hangings, and the beginnings of what would one day become one of the greatest private collections in Europe started quietly to accumulate on the walls of a Northamptonshire farmhouse, turned great house. They were becoming, in a word, gentlemen, and it is worth understanding how completely that transformation had to be performed, because English society was not fooled by money alone. A family had to look right and speak right and marry right and be seen to do the things that gentlemen did. So the Spencer sons went to the universities and the Inns of Court, not usually to become scholars or lawyers, but to acquire the polish and the connections. They served as sheriffs and as members of Parliament for their county. They kept hospitality, feeding and housing the countryside in the old open-handed way. They hunted, they gave to the church, they had themselves painted, and within 100 years of Sir John's sheep, no one meeting his great-grandson could have guessed, or would have dared to mention, where the family's money had come from. There is something almost cold about the efficiency of it, and yet I find it hard not to admire, because it required a discipline across generations that few families in any age have managed. The temptation for a newly rich family is always to spend, to blaze, to buy the biggest house and the loudest title at once, and to be laughed at for it. The Spencers did not blaze, they compounded. They lived below their means, married above their station, and left the profits in the ground, and each generation handed on to the next an estate larger than the one it had received. It is the discipline of the counting house applied to the ascent of a dynasty, and it worked. It is worth being precise about how the marriages worked, because there was an arithmetic beneath the sentiment. A gentry family with money and no name would offer a portion, a lump sum in cash paid over on the wedding day, and in return the daughter received a jointure, an income settled upon her for life should she be widowed, secured against her husband's lands. The negotiation of those two figures, the portion and the jointure, was conducted between lawyers with the ferocity of a treaty, sometimes for years, and the marriage went forward or fell apart on the numbers. What the Spencers had was the ability to put down a portion that no rival could match, and what they wanted in exchange was a jointure charged upon an ancient and noble estate. Money crossing one way, blood crossing the other, and both families satisfied. Consider what the family was doing with its own daughters, because that is where the real strategy lay. A son could be bought a seat in Parliament and a knighthood, and that was useful. But a daughter married into a noble house, planted Spencer blood inside the peerage forever, and Spencer grandchildren would be born to it. Across 3 or 4 generations, their girls went as brides into one great hall after another of the old nobility, carrying large portions with them, and each one established a network of nephews and cousins and obligations that the family could draw upon for the next 100 years. It was, quite consciously, an investment program conducted with children, and it is worth remembering that the children were, on the whole, perfectly willing, because they had been raised to want precisely what their fathers wanted. And there is one more thing that these Tudor generations understood, which their descendants never entirely forgot. Land does not merely produce rent. Land produces standing, and standing produces marriages, and marriages produce land. The 3 things run in a circle, and once the circle is turning fast enough it becomes very difficult to stop. And the family that owns the acres of a county will in time own its politics, its church livings, its parliamentary seats, and a good deal of its imagination. A man who buys a manor is not buying an income. He is buying a place in other people's minds, and the Spencers had grasped this while their neighbours were still counting fleeces. By the time Queen Elizabeth was an old woman, the Spencers stood at the very top of the gentry, as rich as earls, related to half the peerage, seated in a house that was becoming famous and lacking only one thing. They lacked a title. They were still, formally, commoners, so this and so that, knights of the shire, and the mighty gulf between a knight and a lord remained uncrossed. Everything the family had done for 100 years had been aimed, consciously or not, at crossing it. And in the first year of a new king's reign, with the old queen barely cold, that final barrier came down, and the Spencers entered the peerage of England. It is to the man who took them there, and who was reckoned in his own day the richest man in the whole kingdom, that we turn next. His name was Robert Spencer, and he was born in 1570, and he was the man who cashed in a century of patient accumulation. When Queen Elizabeth died in the spring of 1603, and the King of Scotland came down the Great North Road to take her throne as James I of England, one of the first things the new king did, as new kings do, was to make a great scattering of honours. He needed friends, he needed money, he needed to bind the English gentry to a Scottish stranger, and so titles were handed out with a generosity that shocked the old nobility, and among the men raised to the peerage in that first year was Robert Spencer of Althorp, who became Baron of Wormleighton. He had earned it in the only two ways that counted. He was reckoned by common report to be the richest man in England, or at any rate the man with the largest ready income, which in a monarch chronically short of cash is a very interesting quality in a subject. And he had lent freely, as such men were expected to do. The barony was, in a sense, a receipt. Take a moment over that phrase, though, because it is worth savouring. 95 years after a sheep farmer bought a manor in Northamptonshire, that farmer's great-grandson was the wealthiest man in the Kingdom of England, and a peer of the realm. The whole ascent had taken less than a century, and it had been accomplished without a single battle, a single execution, or a single moment of real danger. It had been accomplished by grace. There is nothing else quite like it in the annals of the English nobility, whose fortunes were so overwhelmingly founded on conquest, or on royal favour, or on the plunder of the monasteries. The Spencers bought their way up, coin by coin, fleece by fleece. Robert himself seems to have been a man of some dignity and considerable pride, and one story about him has survived because it is too good to lose. Sitting in the House of Lords, he fell into a quarrel with the Earl of Arundel, scion of the ancient and haughty House of Howard, over some point of privilege, and Robert made a reference to the deeds of his own ancestors. Arundel turned on him with the sneer that the whole English aristocracy had been storing up for 100 years, and said that when Lord Spencer's ancestors were keeping sheep, his own had been doing something rather more distinguished. It was the perfect aristocratic put-down, and it went straight to the family's one soft place. But Robert had the answer ready, and it is the reason we remember the exchange. He replied that when his ancestors were keeping sheep, the Earl's ancestors had been plotting treason. And it was true, and everybody in the chamber knew it was true, because the Howards had been in and out of the tower and up and down the block for a century, and half of them had lost their heads for conspiring against the crown. The lords erupted. Arundel was sent to the tower for a spell to cool off, and the sheep-keeping Spencers had made their point, in front of the entire peerage, that a family which had grown rich honestly by farming had nothing to apologise for to a family that had grown vast by treason. I like that story more than I ought to, because of what it reveals. The Spencers knew exactly where they had come from. They never quite escaped it, and in a way they never entirely wanted to. Sheep appear on their arms. Sheep appear in their houses. There is a strain of unembarrassed practicality that runs through this family for 500 years, a sense that they are landowners first and grandees second, that their state is a business and must be made to pay, and that a man who cannot balance his books has no business calling himself a lord. Not every generation lived up to it, as we shall see, and one or two of them very nearly lost the whole inheritance in the pursuit of glory. But the counting house instinct was always there, somewhere in the family's bones, and more than once it saved them. Robert lived on until the year 1627, deep into the reign of the next king, Charles I. He rebuilt Althorp again, and he received King James there, and he watched his sons and grandsons take their places in the world he had lifted them into. He had done what every Spencer since Sir John had been working towards. He had made the family noble. There is one glimpse of Robert Spencer at home that survives, and it is a charming one. In the summer of 1603, as the new king's family travelled south from Scotland, the Queen and the young Prince Henry broke their journey at Althorp, and Robert, wanting to do the thing properly, engaged the finest dramatist he could find to write an entertainment for their arrival. The man he engaged was Ben Jonson, and so it was that, in the park at Althorp on a June morning, the Queen of England was greeted by a satyr who came skipping out of the trees to speak verses written for the occasion by the greatest comic playwright of the English stage after Shakespeare. It cost a fortune. It was exactly the sort of thing a family newly arrived in the peerage does, and it worked, and the barony followed within the month. Robert's own instincts, once he had the barony, ran towards caution and away from the court. He spoke rarely in the Lords. He avoided the factions that gathered around the king's favourites, and when he did engage, he did so on the unfashionable side of things, resisting the Crown's more inventive schemes for raising money without Parliament. In a reign that made a great many men rich by proximity to the throne, he grew no richer, and he did not need to. He had land and rents and flocks, and the quiet security of a man who owes nothing to anybody. It is a posture that his descendants would abandon spectacularly within 2 generations, and it is one that the shrewdest of them would return to whenever the family ran into trouble. And in doing so, he had brought them within reach of what had never touched them before, and that would now begin to touch them again and again through the centuries that followed. He had brought them close to the crown. A rich grazier in Northamptonshire could live and die without a king ever knowing his name. A baron of the realm could not. A baron of the realm sat in Parliament and took sides, and was courted and threatened and required to declare himself, and when the kingdom tore itself apart, as within 15 years of Robert's death it would, a baron of the realm had to choose. The Spencers, safe for a century behind their hedges, were about to be pulled into the grand quarrel of the English 17th century, and it would cost them, at the first stroke, the life of the most promising young man the family had yet produced. And it is to him, and to the beautiful woman he married, we turn next. Now the story turns, for the first time, from money to blood, and it does so by way of a love affair and a poem. The grandson of the first Baron Spencer was a young man named Henry, born in 1620, who came into his inheritance as a boy and grew up to be everything the family's long ascent had been designed to produce. He was cultivated, he was handsome, he was rich beyond ordinary measure. He had been educated abroad, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a young nobleman who has never in his life doubted his welcome anywhere. And he fell in love, as men of that stamp do, with the most admired girl of the season. Her name was Dorothy Sidney, and she was the daughter of the Earl of Leicester, and she belonged to one of the most romantic families in England, the Sidneys of Penshurst, whose most famous son, Sir Philip Sidney, poet and soldier, had died gloriously in the Low Countries half a century before, and had been mourned as the perfect Elizabethan gentleman. To marry a Sidney was to marry not merely rank but glamour, the very thing all the Spencer money could never quite buy. And Dorothy, by every account, was lovely. She was lovely enough, at any rate, that a poet fell in love with her first. Edmund Waller, one of the smoothest lyric versifiers of the age, pursued her for years in verse, addressing to her a long series of poems in which he called her Saccharissa, from the Latin for sugar, an odd sweet coining of his own that has clung to her ever since. He wrote to her, about her, around her. He was apparently entirely serious, and she was apparently entirely uninterested, and the whole business ended as such things generally do, with the poet immortalizing a rejection he never wanted. It is one of the small ironies of literary history that Dorothy Sidney is remembered, not for the man she married, but for the man she would not have. The man she did have was Henry Spencer, and she married him in the year 1639, and by the little evidence we have, they were happy. He was 22. She was somewhat older. They came home to Althorp, into the calm, rich house among the Northamptonshire fields, with everything before them, and their first child was born, and then a second, and the long Spencer ascent seemed simply to be continuing on its patient upward path, one more brilliant marriage, one more generation, one more turn of the wheel. And then the kingdom broke. It is difficult at this distance to convey the strangeness of the English Civil War, because we know how it ends and they did not, and because we have been taught to see it as a clash of principles when to the men and women who lived through it, it felt for a long while like a hideous family quarrel that had somehow got out of hand. King Charles I and his Parliament had fallen out over money and religion and the proper limits of royal power, and in 1642 the argument became a war. An Englishman who had dined together the previous winter found themselves drawing up in fields to shoot at one another. Neighbours divided, fathers and sons divided, and every man of rank in England was compelled, whether he wished it or not, to declare aside Henry Spencer's instincts, so far as we can see them, were moderate. He was no fire-eating royalist, no believer in the divine and absolute authority of kings. Like a vast many thoughtful, wealthy, unmilitary men of his class, he thought the king had gone too far, and the Parliament had gone further, and he would very much have preferred that the whole thing be settled by sensible people around a table. His wife's family, the Sidneys, leaned the other way. His own father-in-law would serve the Parliament. He might, with a little less honour or a little more caution, have found a way to stand aside. He did not stand aside. When the king raised his standard, Henry Spencer went to him, and he brought with him a large sum of his own money, some thousands of pounds, which he lent to the royal cause at a moment when the royal cause had almost nothing. And the king, who had very little to give in return but honours, and who was already discovering how cheaply he could pay his debts in that coin, made Henry Spencer, in the summer of 1643, the first Earl of Sunderland. So the sheep farmers had an earldom 135 years after the purchase of Althorp. And here we ought to pause, because there is a poignancy in the timing that is easy to miss. The family had been climbing for 5 generations. They had reached the peerage under one king, and now they had reached the higher nobility under another. Everything Sir John Spencer had set in motion had come to fruition in this young man of 23, an earl married to a Sidney, master of one of the mighty houses of England, with a young wife and small children and a fortune that seemed inexhaustible. He held the title for a few weeks. The Sidney name carried a particular magic in that generation, and it is worth explaining because it tells us what money could not buy. Sir Philip Sidney, Dorothy's great-uncle, had been the model of everything an Elizabethan gentleman was supposed to be, poet and courtier and soldier, and he had died at 32 of a wound taken in the Low Countries, and the manner of his death had made him immortal. The story went that, as he lay wounded and desperately thirsty, a bottle of water was brought to him, and he saw a dying common soldier looking at it, and he passed it across, saying that the man's need was greater than his own. Whether it happened exactly so hardly matters. England believed it, and Sydney became the pattern of chivalry, and to marry into that family was to marry into a legend. And the war divided that circle as it divided everything. Dorothy's own father took the Parliament's side and served it abroad. Her brother Algernon Sidney would become one of the most famous Republicans in England, a man who believed kings were the servants of the people and said so in a book, and who was in the end brought to the scaffold for it under Charles II, and whose writings were studied a century later by the men who made the American Revolution. So the family Henry Spencer married into produced a Republican martyr, and Henry died fighting for the king, and Dorothy loved them both, and had to go on living in an England where each side thought the other had killed the country. There is no tidy way to be a family in a civil war. Althorp in those years was at its most beautiful and most oblivious. The young couple came back to a house full of pictures and music, and Dorothy's letters from that period are full of small domestic happinesses, the garden, the children, the visitors, her husband's plans for improving the park. And 100 miles away in London, the king and his parliament were sliding into a quarrel that neither of them could stop, and men who had never held a weapon were beginning to think about which side they would take if it came to that. And nobody at Althorp, sitting down to dinner beneath the Van Dykes, believed for a moment that it would, and it is to what happened at Newbury in the September of that same year, and to the woman who was left behind, that we turn next. He did not want to be there. That is the thing about Henry Spencer that comes down to us most clearly across the centuries, in the letters he wrote to his wife from the King's army, and it is what makes his death so hard to read about even now. He was not a soldier. He did not like the war. He wrote home to Dorothy from the camps and the marches in a voice of weary, affectionate exasperation, complaining of the cold, of the boredom, of the quarrelsome idiots surrounding the king, of the sheer waste and folly of the whole business. He wanted to come home. He said so plainly more than once. He had chosen his side out of a sense of obligation rather than any zeal, and he served it because he had said he would, and he counted the days. In one letter he wrote to her that he would have been happier if he had never left her, and that if there were not so much of shame in it and the ruin of his own reputation, he would leave the army and come back to Althorp. That is not the voice of a cavalier of legend. It is the voice of a young husband who has made a decision he regrets and can see no honourable way out of it. The Battle of Newbury was fought on the 20th of September in 1643, and it was the sort of grinding indecisive slaughter that the Civil War produced with dreary regularity. The King's army stood across the road by which the Parliament's army was trying to march home to London, and the Parliament's army had to come through, and so they came, and the two forces spent a long day in the fields and hedgerows shooting one another at close quarters. The fighting was heavy. The infantry stood and killed each other in the smoke for hours, and Henry Spencer, 1st Earl of Sunderland, 23 years old, was struck by a cannon shot and killed. His body was carried from the field. He had held his earldom for about a month. Dorothy was at home, expecting a child. The news came to her at Althorp, in the way such news came, by a rider on the road, and it broke her. The letters she wrote afterwards are not showy in their grief, and they are the worse to read for that. She was a woman of her age, and her age expected composure, and she was composed. And beneath the composure you can feel the shock going all the way down. She never remarried for the better part of the rest of her long life. She kept his letters. When she died more than 50 years later, in a wholly different England, under a wholly different dynasty, having outlived the war and the king's execution and the Republic and the Restoration and another revolution besides. She still had them. I want to sit with this for a moment, because it is the first time in our story that the Spencers pay a real price for what they have become. For 135 years, the family's rise had been almost bloodless. They had made money and bought land and married well and buried their dead in the ordinary way. The great and terrible events of English history had passed over their heads and left them richer. And now, at the exact instant of their arrival at the top, the young man in whom the whole long ascent was embodied lay dead in a field in Berkshire, killed in a war he despised, for a king who could not pay him, having gained a title he had no time to use. That is the bargain the Spencers had made without quite knowing they were making it. To be great in England is to be visible, and to be visible is to be reachable, by kings and by parliaments, and by cannon shot. The hedges of Northamptonshire no longer sheltered them. From this point forward, for the next 3.5 centuries, whenever the history of England convulsed, the Spencers would be somewhere near the centre of it, and it would cost them. The earldom passed to Henry's infant son, another Robert, a baby who had barely known his father. Dorothy raised him. The estates were placed under the protection of trustees, and the family, having so recently declared for the losing side, faced the long, unpleasant business of making its peace with the victors. Fines were paid, compositions were negotiated. The Spencers, being rich and being sensible, survived the Republic without serious damage, as they had survived every other upheaval, and the sheep went on grazing in the park whether England had a king or not. Dorothy Sidney lived on for more than 50 years after Newbury, and hers is one of those long, quiet aftermaths that history rarely troubles to record. She married again, eventually, unhappily, and that marriage too ended. She saw the king her husband had died for taken out onto a scaffold in Whitehall and beheaded before a silent crowd. She saw England become a republic and then cease to be one. She raised her son to be an earl in a country that had for 11 years abolished earls. And Edmund Waller, the poet who had loved her and lost her and made her famous under a name she never chose, met her again when they were both old, and she asked him, lightly, when he would write such fine verses to her again, and he answered, with a courtier's cruelty and a poet's honesty, that he would when she was as young again and as handsome. There is a particular cruelty in the timing of a death like Henry Spencer's, and the 17th century felt it as sharply as we do. He had been an earl for 1 month. The patent creating him had cost the king nothing, and had cost Henry his life, since it was in some sense the seal upon a bargain by which a rich young man lent his fortune and then, having lent it, could not honourably stay away from the fighting. Charles I created a great many peers in those years for exactly that reason, and a striking number of them were dead within 2 years, killed at Edgehill and Newbury and Marston Moor. The nobility of England paid a heavier price in that war than it would pay again until 1914. But the boy who grew up in that house, fatherless, in the shadow of a war his family had lost, and under the care of a mother who had been made a widow at the height of her beauty, would turn out to be quite unlike any Spencer before him. He would inherit the wealth and the earldom and the house. He would not inherit the honesty. He would become one of the most spectacularly untrustworthy men in English public life, a politician of such flexible principle that he served 3 kings in succession while betraying at least 2 of them, and he would be, in the cold reckoning of survival, magnificently successful at it. And it is to this remarkable and unlovable man that we turn next. Robert Spencer, 2nd Earl of Sunderland, is one of those figures whom historians reach for when they want to illustrate what politics can do to a soul, and he has been called, by writers not given to overstatement, one of the most consummate rogues ever to hold high office in England. He was clever, charming, sardonic, indolent, faithless, and possessed of an eye for the main chance, so unclouded by principle that it amounted almost to a kind of purity, and he survived. That was his art. Across 4 decades of the most dangerous politics England has ever known, through plots and purges and a revolution that sent one king running for his life across the Channel, Robert Spencer kept his head, kept his house, and kept, most of the time, his place at the very centre of power. He entered politics under Charles II, the restored king, in whose easy, cynical court he found himself thoroughly at home. He was made a diplomat, then a Secretary of State, one of the 2 men who ran the king's foreign policy and much of the domestic besides. He was good at it, in the way that a certain kind of intelligent, unscrupulous man is always good at it, alert to the drift of events, tireless in cultivating whoever seemed likely to be useful next, entirely without the encumbrance of conviction. Then came the great crisis of that reign, the long convulsion over whether the king's brother James, an open Roman Catholic, should be permitted to inherit the throne of a Protestant kingdom. The country divided. Parliament tried 3 times to exclude James, and Robert Spencer, weighing it up, decided the exclusion would pass and voted for it, and thereby betrayed his master the king, who was fighting for his brother's rights with everything he had. It was a catastrophic misjudgment. The king won, and Robert Spencer was dismissed in disgrace, and went into the wilderness, and by every ordinary reckoning his career was finished. Except that he came back. Within 2 years he had crawled his way back into favour by flattery, by the intercession of the king's mistresses, by a display of contrition so abject and so obviously insincere that Charles, who was not deceived for a moment, took him back anyway, apparently because he found him useful and entertaining. And when Charles died, and the Catholic James did come to the throne after all, the man who had voted to bar him found himself not merely retained but promoted, and in a few years he was the most powerful minister in England. What he did then is the thing for which he is chiefly remembered, and it takes a strong stomach to admire. James II wanted to bring England back to Rome, and moved with a haste and a clumsiness that terrified his own subjects. And Robert Spencer, to keep his place at the king's side, converted. He renounced the Protestant faith of his fathers, and was received into the Catholic Church, and he did it publicly, at the very moment when doing so bound him irreversibly to a king whom half the nation was preparing to depose. Then, having gone over, he began quietly to correspond with the king's enemies. When the Revolution came, in the autumn of 1688, and William of Orange landed with an army, and James's own officers and daughters deserted him, Robert Spencer was among the first to be pushed out, and he fled abroad, and everybody assumed that this time surely he was done. He was a convert, a collaborator, the architect of the deposed king's worst policies, hated by every party in England. He went to Holland. He renounced Catholicism as smoothly as he had embraced it. He wrote a pamphlet explaining that he had been misunderstood all along, that he had in fact been working secretly for the Protestant cause the whole time by giving the king bad advice on purpose. Almost nobody believed him. King William believed him, or, more precisely, King William, a hard practical Dutchman who cared nothing for English scruples and needed to know how the English Parliament actually worked, recognised that Robert Spencer understood the management of politics better than any other man alive. So the traitor came home and became the new king's confidential adviser, and taught him the grand secret of governing England, which was that a king must choose his ministers from whichever party commands the Commons, rather than from among his personal friends. It is not too much to say that this cynical and dishonourable man helped to invent the mechanism by which Britain has been governed ever since. To understand how Robert Spencer survived, you have to understand the machinery he mastered, which was the Secret Service money and the management of Parliament. In the England of that age, the Crown had no organised party and no whips, and every session was a scramble in which members were persuaded, bought, promised places, or frightened into supporting the government of the day. Sunderland was a master of this dark art. He kept lists. He knew who wanted a customs post for a nephew, who was in debt, who could be reached through a mistress, who was merely vain and needed flattering. He was, in effect, the first great political manager in English history, and the machinery he perfected of patronage and management, and the careful counting of heads, became the ordinary machinery of British politics for the next century and a half. The Popish plot, which convulsed England in the years around 1680, gives the measure of the world he moved in. A disreputable clergyman named Titus Oates invented, out of nothing whatever, an elaborate Catholic conspiracy to murder the king, and the country believed him, and for 3 years a kind of madness gripped the capital. Innocent men were tried on perjured evidence and hanged. Peers went to the Tower, mobs burned effigies in the streets, and politicians of every stripe used the terror to destroy their rivals, knowing perfectly well that the whole thing was a fabrication. It ended when the hysteria burned itself out and Oates was whipped through the streets. Robert Spencer navigated the whole of it without ever once telling anybody what he actually thought. He was, it should be said, superb company. That is part of the explanation, and it is the part that moralists always leave out. Contemporaries who loathed his politics and distrusted his word recorded, almost against their will, that an evening with Sunderland was one of the pleasures of London, that he was witty and unpompous and wonderfully indiscreet about people he had betrayed that morning, and that he had the rare gift of making whoever he was speaking to feel like the cleverest person in the room. Charm of that order is a political asset, and he spent it as freely as he spent everything else. He died in 1702, in his bed at Althorp, still rich, still an earl, and still, one imagines, faintly amused. Judge him as you please, and there is an immense deal to be said against him. But note what he did for the family. He kept the estate through the collapse of 2 regimes. He was in office under 3 kings and a queen. And he did something else, something quieter, and for the future of the Spencers, more consequential than all his intrigues, because he arranged for his son to marry the daughter of a soldier who was about to become the most celebrated man in Europe, and whose wife was the closest friend of the Queen of England. Through that one marriage, the Spencers would acquire a fortune, a palace, a dukedom, and the extraordinary woman whose money and whose will would shape the family for 200 years. And it is to that marriage, and to the books that the bridegroom loved better than people, that we turn next. The son of the turncoat was named Charles, and he was, in almost every particular, his father's opposite, which happens more often in families than we like to admit. Where Robert had been supple, Charles was rigid. Where Robert had believed in nothing, Charles believed with a fierce and tactless passion in the Whig cause, in parliamentary liberty, in the Protestant succession, and in the wickedness of anybody who disagreed. He was rude, he was proud, he was politically maladroit, and he made enemies the way other men make small talk. He also had one redeeming and rather beautiful obsession, and it was books. Charles Spencer, 3rd Earl of Sunderland, assembled at Althorp what was, by the time he had finished with it, one of the finest private libraries in Europe. He bought with the single-minded acquisitive fury of the true collector, hunting down early printed books, the productions of the first presses of Italy and Germany, the incunabula that had come off the wooden presses in the first decades after Gutenberg. He bought manuscripts. He bought Greek and Latin classics in editions no other private man in England possessed. When a vast continental library came onto the market, his agents were there. He gathered, in the end, some 20,000 volumes, In an age when a gentleman's library of a few hundred was thought handsome, and he crammed them into rooms at Althorp and later into a house in London, and he knew, so his contemporaries grumbled, the contents and the condition and the price of every single one. It was said of him, unkindly and probably accurately, that he cared more for his books than for his wife or his children or the government of England. Books, unlike people, could be catalogued, but it is his marriage that concerns us, because it changed everything. In the year 1699 he married Anne Churchill, and the Churchills at that moment were the family in England most obviously going somewhere. Her father was John Churchill, a soldier of genius, who within a few years would be Duke of Marlborough, the man who broke the armies of Louis XIV at Blenheim and Ramillies and Oudenarde and Malplaquet, and who was rewarded by a grateful nation with a dukedom, an enormous sum of money, and a royal manor at Woodstock, upon which to build the vast Baroque palace that still bears the name of his greatest victory. Marlborough was the most famous soldier in Europe, and her mother was Sarah. Yet, Anne Churchill herself appears in the record as a gentle, intelligent, well-liked young woman, known to the family as the Little Whig, who bore her difficult husband several children, and who died young at 8 and 30 in 1716, long before any of the mighty inheritances came her way. It is one of the quiet sadnesses tucked into this story. Everything that flowed to the Spencers through Anne, the Marlborough money, the Marlborough name, the Marlborough palace, flowed to them because of a woman who did not live to see a penny of it. Charles himself went on to become, improbably, First Lord of the Treasury, which is to say something close to what we would now call Prime Minister, though the office had not yet hardened into that shape. He was not much good at it. He was implicated in the vast financial catastrophe known as the South Sea Bubble, when half the political class of England was found to have taken shares in a fraudulent company, and though he was formally acquitted, his reputation never recovered. He died in the year 1722, and left behind a mountain of books and a tangle of debts and 3 sons. And it is here, at this junction, that the Spencer story divides into 2 rivers, and if you have ever wondered why there are Spencers at Althorp and Spencer Churchills at Blenheim, and why Winston Churchill and Diana, Princess of Wales, were distant cousins, the explanation lies in the next 20 years, and in the iron will of one old woman. Because Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, outlived them all. She outlived her daughter Anne. She outlived her son-in-law Charles. She outlived her own husband, the Duke, and her 2 sons, and she sat on at the head of the family for 2 decades more, immensely rich, immensely formidable, quarrelling with everybody, deciding with absolute authority who among her grandchildren should have what. The Marlborough dukedom, by a special act of Parliament, could pass through the female line, and so it descended to her daughter's children, which meant that a Spencer would in time become Duke of Marlborough and take possession of Blenheim. The library that Charles Spencer built deserves a moment of its own, because collections of that kind are not merely accumulations of objects, they are arguments. What the 3rd Earl of Sunderland was assembling, without perhaps ever saying so, was the physical evidence of the recovery of the ancient world, book by book, press by press, in the first half-century after printing came to Europe. To hold in your hands a Venetian edition of Aristotle, printed in the 1490s, is to hold the moment at which the thought of Greece became reproducible and therefore unkillable. He gathered these things by the hundred, whatever else the man was, and he was tactless and quarrelsome and a poor minister. He understood what he had, and he built at Althorp a monument to the survival of learning. The South Sea Bubble deserves a sentence, because it is the first modern financial catastrophe, and it caught almost the whole governing class of England in its net. A company was formed, holding a monopoly of trade with the Spanish possessions in the Americas, a trade which barely existed. Its shares were talked up and rose, and everybody bought, and the price went to 10 times what it had been within a few months, and then it collapsed, and then thousands were ruined. It emerged afterwards that ministers had been given shares for nothing in exchange for their support. The scandal broke the government, and it touched Charles Spencer, who was investigated and formally cleared, and who was never again believed by anybody. Anna Churchill's death is one of those small hinges upon which a great deal turns. She was 38. She left 5 children, among them the boy who would inherit the dukedom, and the boy upon whom his grandmother's fortune would descend. Had she lived another 30 years, as her mother did, the Marlborough inheritance would have passed through her in the ordinary way, and the whole subsequent shape of the family, the split of the line, the strange condition in the will, might never have happened at all. Instead, her fierce and grieving mother sat on top of the fortune for another 28 years, and disposed of it exactly as her own judgment dictated, and the Spencers of Althorp exist in their present form because of it. But the Marlborough money, which was a separate matter entirely, and which Sarah controlled to the last shilling of it, would go where Sarah wished, and Sarah, who had strong views about all her descendants, had picked out a favourite. Before we follow that fortune to its destination, we must meet the woman herself, because she is one of the most extraordinary people in this or any family history, and because for a decade she was the most powerful woman in England, and the closest friend of a queen, until the friendship broke in a manner that has fascinated everyone who has looked at it since. And it is to Sarah that we turn next. Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, was born plain Sarah Jennings in 1660, into a family of small gentry with almost nothing to recommend it but a foothold at court, and she died 84 years later as the richest woman in England, having ruled a queen, built a palace, quarrelled with virtually every person she ever met, and made herself so feared that ministers of state went pale at the sight of her handwriting. She had 2 great gifts. The first was beauty of a fair, high-coloured, blazing kind, which brought her at the age of 15 or so to the attention of a young officer named John Churchill, who was then attached to the household of the Duke of York and who was making his way in the world by the usual mixture of soldiering and charm. He fell in love with her. The remarkable thing, in an age of arranged and mercenary marriages, is that he stayed in love with her, and she with him, for 4 decades, and the letters that passed between them across the years, while he was campaigning in Flanders and she was fighting her wars at home, are among the most affecting in the English language. Whatever else Sarah was, and she was a vast many difficult things, she was a wife who loved her husband and was loved by him without interruption until the day he died. Her second gift was a personality of such force that it operated on those around her like weather. She was direct where the court was, oblique, blunt where the court was flattering, contemptuous of ceremony, incapable of pretending to an opinion she did not hold, and utterly without fear. In a world of courtiers, she said what she thought, and to one particular person, this was the most intoxicating quality imaginable. That person was Princess Anne, the younger daughter of James II, who would in time become Queen of England. Anne was shy, stout, chronically ill, painfully unsure of herself, and starved of genuine affection. She had endured a life of almost unimaginable sorrow, bearing something like 17 children and losing every one of them, most in infancy, the last, her beloved boy, at 11. She was not clever, she was decent and stubborn and lonely. And from her girlhood she was passionately attached to Sarah Jennings, who was everything Anne was not, brilliant and confident and alive. Their friendship, and it was a friendship of an intensity that startles modern readers, became the central relationship of Anne's life, so that they might speak as equals, unencumbered by the difference in rank. They adopted private names for one another in their letters. Anne was Mrs. Morley. Sarah was Mrs. Freeman. For years the future queen wrote to her friend in terms of the most abject devotion, begging for her company, dreading her absence, describing herself as her poor unfortunate faithful Morley. When Anne came to the throne in 1702, Sarah came with her and was loaded with every office a woman could hold at court, and her husband was given the command of the armies, and for the better part of a decade the Marlboroughs stood at the summit of England, the soldier winning the war abroad and his wife ruling the Queen at home. It could not last, and the reason it could not last is Sarah herself. She was a Whig ardently, and Anne was by instinct a Tory, and Sarah could not let it alone. She lectured the Queen. She hectored her. She wrote her long, angry letters about politics and told her she was being deceived by wicked men and that she must dismiss this minister and appoint that one. She treated the sovereign of England as a rather slow pupil who would come round if only the argument were repeated loudly enough. And Anne, who was slow, but who was also, beneath the shyness, the granddaughter of Charles I, and had an immense deal more iron in her than anybody credited, began, very quietly, to withdraw. Into the space that Sarah's hectoring had opened, there came a poor relation, a cousin of Sarah's own whom Sarah herself had brought to court out of kindness, a soft-voiced, watchful, unassuming woman named Abigail Masham. She did not lecture, she listened. She played the harpsichord to the Queen in the evenings and said little, and agreed often, and she was, in her own quiet way, quite as political as Sarah, and considerably better at it. And by degrees, in the way these things happen, the Queen's affection moved. When Sarah understood what had occurred, she behaved as badly as it is possible to behave. She raged. She accused. She reproached the Queen for ingratitude in language that no subject had used to a monarch in living memory. She threatened in the last extremity to publish Anne's old letters, those adoring letters of the Mrs. Morley years, and though she never did it, the threat was made, and it was unforgivable. There was a final interview, in the spring of 1710, in which Sarah talked and wept and demanded to be heard, and the Queen said almost nothing, and repeated, over and over, that Sarah might put anything she had to say in writing. And then Anne said one sentence which ended a friendship of 30 years, and it was simply that there was nothing to answer. The building of Blenheim Palace, which occupied the last 4 decades of Sarah's life, tells you everything about her. Parliament had voted the money and the manor, and the architect was John Vanbrugh, a man of enormous Baroque imagination who wanted to build a monument to a nation's victory. Sarah wanted a house. The two of them fought for 20 years over the stone and the bridge and the accounts and the very purpose of the thing, and when the money ran short she blamed him, and when he came long afterwards, an old man, to look at the finished building he had designed, the Duchess of Marlborough gave orders that he was not to be admitted to the park, and he was turned away at the gate, and never saw the inside of his masterpiece. The private names in those letters are worth dwelling on, because they explain the wound. Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman were not a joke. They were a fiction that 2 women maintained for 30 years, so that one of them could, for an hour at a time, stop being royal. Anne had been a princess from birth and would be a queen, and every person she had ever met had been calculating something while they spoke to her, and Sarah, alone in the world, appeared not to be. That was the gift, and when the gift was withdrawn, when the frank friend turned out to want offices for her relations and policies for her party like everybody else, the loss was not political. It was the loss of the only room in England where Anne had been an ordinary woman. Sarah was dismissed. Her husband was dismissed. The gold key of her office was surrendered, and she went off to superintend the building of Blenheim Palace, that colossal monument to her husband's victories, quarrelling furiously with its architect, and she lived on for another 34 years, growing richer and older and more ferocious, watching her descendants for signs of the qualities she prized and preparing to dispose of the greatest private fortune in England. And it is to what she did with it, and to the extraordinary conditions she attached, that we turn next. Old age did not soften Sarah, and widowhood did not either. When the Duke died, in 1722, she was 62, and she had 22 more to live, and she spent them in the exercise of the only power a woman of her time could hold outright, which was the power of money. She had a colossal amount of it. The nation's gratitude, her husband's careful investments, her own shrewdness with property and the funds, had built a fortune that has been estimated as one of the largest in private hands anywhere in Europe. And every penny that was not entailed upon the dukedom was hers to give away exactly as she chose. She chose ferociously, and by temperament rather than by rule. Sarah's descendants learned that they stood or fell entirely by whether the old woman approved of them, and that her approval could be lost in an afternoon, and that once lost it, did not return. She struck relatives out of her will and put them back and struck them out again. She fought with her surviving daughters, savagely and publicly, one of them for years. She pursued the architect of Blenheim through the courts. She turned down 2 dukes who proposed to marry her, remarking to one of them that if she were young and beautiful again, she would not permit even the Emperor of the world to succeed in the place her Marlborough had held. And out of the whole tribe of her grandchildren, she settled her heart upon a young man named John Spencer, the younger son of her daughter Anne, and of that bookish Earl of Sunderland we met a little while ago. Why she loved him is not entirely clear. He does not seem to have been especially admirable. He was pleasant and idle and a hard drinker, and he did not much bother himself with public affairs. Possibly that last quality was the point. Perhaps, after a lifetime spent among politicians, Sarah simply liked a young man who was not one. Because when she made her will, and left to John Spencer the vast bulk of her personal fortune, along with houses and estates and the great treasure of pictures and plate, she attached to the gift a condition so revealing of her whole life that it stands as a kind of epitaph. John Spencer was to have the money on the express understanding that he should never accept any office or place under the crown, save only that of Master of the Royal Hunt, which was a sinecure and involved dogs. If he took a government post, he forfeited the lot. Think about what that condition means. Here was a woman who had spent 30 years at the very centre of English power, who had governed a queen, made ministers, and been ruined by court politics. And her final judgment upon the whole business, delivered from the far side of a lifetime, was that no one she loved should ever go near it. She had seen what service to the crown had done to her husband, hounded from his command and driven abroad by his enemies. She had seen what it had done to her friendship with Anne. She had seen what it did to her son-in-law, publicly disgraced, and she wanted her favourite grandson kept clean of it. "Take the money," she said in effect, "and buy your land and breed your horses and stay away from kings." She died in 1744, in her house at Marlborough, 85 years old, having outlived nearly everyone she had ever quarrelled with. And the immense fortune passed to John Spencer of Althorp. Now the family stood at a peculiar and rather magnificent crossroads. There were 2 great inheritances in play, and the elder brother took one and the younger took the other. The elder brother, Charles, succeeded in due course to the dukedom of Marlborough and to Blenheim Palace and to the illustrious military name, and his descendants carry the surname Spencer Churchill and live there still, and it is from that branch 2 centuries later that Winston Churchill would come. The younger brother John had the money. He had Althorp, the old family seat, and Sarah's treasure, and the freedom to do nothing whatever with his life, which by all accounts he embraced with enthusiasm. He drank, he hunted, he gambled, and he died at 38 in the year 1746, only 2 years after coming into the greatest inheritance in England, having spent it energetically and produced one son. So the two lines parted. The Marlborough Spencers went to the palace, and the name and the glory. The Althorp Spencers went to the money and the house and the pictures, and in the fullness of time, to a fame of a different order entirely. Two brothers, two rivers running side by side through English history, meeting occasionally at weddings and funerals, one of them arriving at last at a wartime prime minister, the other at a princess. The condition Surrey attached was not the whim of an eccentric old woman. It was a considered verdict, and it had teeth. Her grandson was to be excluded from every place, pension, office, and employment under the crown, and if he took one, the estates and the money were to pass elsewhere. There were only 2 exceptions written into the deed. He might be Ranger of Windsor Great Park, which was a matter of deer, and he might hold the office of Master of the Royal Hunt, which was a matter of hounds. In other words, horses, dogs, land, and no politicians. It is the last word of a woman who had stood as close to the throne of England as any subject can stand, and had been burned to the bone by it, and had decided that no one she loved would go there again. 2 brothers, then, and 2 houses, and it is worth standing between them for a moment. Blenheim is a monument, built by a nation to celebrate a victory, enormous, theatrical, magnificent, and famously uncomfortable. A palace conceived as an argument in stone. Althorp is a home grown by accretion across 4 centuries, remodelled and refaced and lived in continuously by the same family, holding its treasures on ordinary walls in ordinary rooms. The elder brother got the monument, the younger got the home, and of the 2 branches, it is not obvious that the one with the palace had the better of it. And it is the younger river we follow. That drunken, amiable, short-lived John Spencer left a boy, another John, who inherited all the money at the age of 2, and who would grow up to be given the title his family had wanted for 250 years, and to spend Sarah's fortune on turning Althorp into one of the loveliest houses in England. And it is to him, and to the earldom of the Spencers at last, that we turn next. The boy who inherited Sarah's fortune at the age of 2 was raised, as such boys were, in a hothouse of expectation and flattery, and by the time he came of age, he was the possessor of an income so large that scarcely anybody in England could match it. His name, like his father's, was John Spencer. He was born in 1734, and he did 2 things with his life that matter to us, one of which was to marry for love, which was unusual, and the other of which was to make Althorp beautiful, which was expensive. The marriage came first, and it is a charming story in a family history that is not always full of charming stories. He fell in love with Georgiana Poyntz, the daughter of a diplomat, a girl of good family and no vast fortune, which is to say she brought him nothing that his advisers would have valued. He married her anyway, and he did it in secret at Althorp at midnight, during a great ball he was holding for his coming of age, slipping away with her from his own party to be wed in the little dressing-room upstairs while several hundred guests danced below. Then they came back down and rejoined the dancing, and nobody knew. They were by every surviving indication devoted to one another for the whole of their lives, and their eldest daughter, born 3 years later, was named after her mother. The title came in 1765, when the young King George III created him Earl Spencer, and with that the family arrived, formally and finally, where Sir John the sheep farmer had been pointing them for 2.5 centuries. There had been that brief flare of an earldom in the Civil War, snuffed out at Newbury, and carried on afterwards under the Sunderland name in the elder branch. But this was the Spencer earldom in their own name at their own house, and it has been held by the head of the family ever since. And then the spending began, and I want to describe it, because the Althorp that the first Earl Spencer made is essentially the Althorp of tonight, the house at the end of the Lime Avenue. He had one of the grand fortunes of Europe and the taste, or at any rate the advisers, to use it. The old Tudor and Stuart house, a red brick pile grown by accretion across 2 centuries, was remodelled and refined. Later generations would encase the brick in the pale grey mathematical tiles that give the house its cool, restrained, faintly severe face today. Inside, room after room was thrown open, decorated, hung, and into those rooms went the accumulated treasure of 200 years and the new purchases of an age of unprecedented collecting. The pictures at Althorp are the point. Van Dyck, who had painted the Stuart court, hung there in force, including the mighty portraits of the family's own 17th century ancestors, so that Henry Spencer, who died at Newbury, and Dorothy Sidney, his widow, looked down from the walls at their descendants. Rubens, Lely, Reynolds and Gainsborough, who painted the living family. Wall upon wall of English and continental portraiture, assembled by a family who had been buying steadily since the days of Elizabeth, and who now had the money to buy anything they wanted. Furniture, porcelain, silver, including plate that had come to them from Sarah and from the Marlboroughs. And the books, the enormous library of the bookish 3rd Earl of Sunderland, migrated at last to Althorp and installed in a long gallery, and there they sat, 20,000 volumes of the earliest printing in Europe, in a country house in Northamptonshire. It became, by common consent, one of the half-dozen finest private houses in England, and its owners, in the way of the 18th century aristocracy, moved between it and their vast London mansion and their other estates in a stately annual migration, attended by an army of servants, spending money on a scale that even now is difficult to comprehend. There is a paradox here worth pausing on. Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, had given her fortune to this family on condition that they stay out of politics, and her purpose was to keep them safe. And it worked, in a fashion. The Spencers of the 18th century were not political adventurers of the old dangerous kind. Nobody was executed. Nobody fled abroad. But money on that scale cannot really be kept out of politics in a country where Parliament was largely composed of the friends and relations of great landowners, and the family drifted into public life regardless, as Whigs, as patrons, as the owners of parliamentary seats. And within 1 generation the sheltered fortune had produced a daughter who would fling herself into the political life of England more spectacularly and more ruinously than any Spencer before her. The face that Althorp shows the world today is not brick at all, and there is a small architectural mystery in it. Late in the 18th century, the old red house was clad in what are called mathematical tiles, thin slips of fired clay hung on battens and pointed to resemble brickwork, and then the whole was given a wash of pale grey, so that the building presents a cool, flat, faintly Dutch composure, quite unlike the warm Tudor pile beneath. Opinions have always differed about it. Some find the grey severity a masterpiece of restraint, and some find it a mask laid over a friendlier face. But it is what you see at the end of the Lime Avenue, and it has weathered 2 centuries, and it is now as much the house as anything under it. Vaughan points, the girl he married at midnight, deserves to be more than a footnote. She was clever, warm, deeply religious in a practical, unfussy way, and by the standards of her class, an extraordinary mother, insisting on nursing her own children when fashionable women sent theirs to wet nurses in the country, and writing to them all her life with an unaffected tenderness. She founded schools. She managed her husband's affairs when he was ill, and she watched her brilliant daughter climb into a glittering marriage and go under, and she wrote her letters of advice and comfort for 30 years, and paid what she could of the debts, and never once, so far as one can tell, said that she had told her so. She was that first daughter named for her mother, born in 1757. She would marry a duke at 17 and become the most talked about woman in the kingdom, a figure of such celebrity that crowds gathered in the street to watch her step from her carriage. She would campaign in elections, hold a salon that made and unmade governments, set the fashion for a generation, and lose at the card table sums of money that would have bought a village. And it is to Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, that we turn next. She was married at 17, on her birthday, to the Duke of Devonshire, who was 10 years older and one of the richest men in England, and it was regarded on all sides as a magnificent match. William Cavendish, 5th Duke of Devonshire, possessed Chatsworth and Devonshire House and Hardwick and Lismore and coal mines and rent rolls beyond counting. What he did not possess, as his young bride discovered rather quickly, was any capacity whatever for expressing warmth. He was cold, taciturn, undemonstrative, fond of cards and dogs and the company of men, and he had a mistress. Georgiana was a girl of tumbling enthusiasm, hungry for affection, physically incapable of concealing an emotion. They were as badly matched as two well-meaning people could be. And so she did what many unhappy women of her class and century did, which was to pour the whole of herself into public life. But she did it on a scale nobody had seen before, and with a genius for public performance that made her, in effect, the first modern celebrity in England. She set the fashion, absolutely and instantly. What Georgiana wore, the country wore. When she put ostrich plumes a yard high in her hair, every woman of style in London went about looking like an aviary. When she powdered her hair, they powdered theirs. Caricaturists drew her endlessly. Newspapers reported her movements. Crowds gathered outside Devonshire House to see her come and go, and when she appeared in the street, people climbed on walls to look at her, and this intensity of the attention has a quality that any modern reader will recognize instantly and uneasily. She was also, and this is more interesting than the plumes, a serious political operator. Devonshire House was the headquarters of the Whig party, and Georgiana was its hostess, which in an age when politics was conducted in drawing rooms as much as in the Commons made her something close to a party manager. She befriended and promoted the great Whig leader Charles James Fox. She raised money. She wrote and distributed political material. She studied the pamphlets and understood the arguments, and knew, at any moment, precisely who was wavering and who could be brought round with a dinner. And in the Westminster election of 1784, she went out into the streets and canvassed for Fox in person, walking into shops and public houses in one of the roughest constituencies in England, asking working men for their votes. It was, for a duchess, an act of astonishing boldness, and the reaction was savage. The opposition press turned on her with a viciousness that is unpleasant to read even now, accusing her of trading kisses for votes, printing coarse cartoons, suggesting she had sold herself for the cause. She was, in the language of the day, unsexed. She went on canvassing. Fox won the seat, and Georgiana learned, at 27, the exact price a woman paid in that England for stepping outside the drawing room, and she was still paying it when she died. The other vast fact of her life is more painful, and I mean to state it plainly and without dwelling, because it is essential to understanding her, and because pretending otherwise would be a kind of lie. Georgiana gambled, and she could not stop. From her earliest married years, she played faro and whist for stakes that were ruinous, even by the standards of a class that thought nothing of losing a house at cards. She lost, and borrowed to cover the loss, and lost again, and concealed the debts from her husband, and borrowed from bankers and friends and money-lenders, and even humiliatingly from men who wanted something else from her in return. The sums became astronomical. She was, for most of her adult life, hunted by creditors, and she carried the secret of it like a stone in her chest, and it made her ill, and she confessed it in installments across the decades, each time swearing it was the whole, and each time discovering there was more. It ran alongside everything else: the beauty, the fame, the fashion, the politics, the very real charm that made people love her all her life, and underneath it this thing gnawing away. It is an old story and a modern one. She could not help it, and she despised herself for it, and she did it again. Her household arrangements, meanwhile, had become extraordinary even by the standards of the 18th century aristocracy. Her closest friend in the world was Lady Elizabeth Foster, who came to live with the Devonshires, and who became, in time, the Duke's mistress and bore him children, and who remained, through all of it, Georgiana's dearest companion. The three of them lived together for a quarter of a century, in an arrangement that scandalized outsiders, and that appears remarkably to have been founded on genuine affection all round. Georgiana bore her own children, and had a daughter by another man during a period abroad, a child she was compelled to surrender and could never publicly acknowledge, and that grief stayed with her too. She died in 1806, at 48, worn out. And what was remarkable was the mourning. The crowds came again, as they had come to watch her all her life, and stood in the streets, and the newspapers that had savaged her wrote of little else. And Charles James Fox, dying himself, said that the finest creature in England had gone. The circle that gathered at Devonshire House was one of the most remarkable in English social history, and it was very largely Georgiana's creation. Politicians, writers, actresses, exiled French aristocrats, scientists and rakes moved through those rooms, and the tone of the place was one of brilliant, dangerous, unbuttoned talk in which women spoke as freely as men, and nobody was safe from being laughed at. Its members had their own manner of speech, a drawling, half-lisping accent that was mimicked all over London. They were by any ordinary standard appallingly behaved, and they were also generous, funny, politically brave, and genuinely devoted to one another across decades. Nothing quite like it existed before, and nothing like it survived the war with France. There is a private grief in Georgiana's story that is easy to hurry past. During a long period abroad, in exile from her husband's household, she bore a daughter to another man, a young politician who would one day be Prime Minister. The child was called Eliza. She was taken from her mother almost at once, given to the father's family to raise, and Georgiana was permitted to see her only as a distant benefactress, a friend of the family, a woman who took a kindly interest. She never acknowledged her, and she could not, and she saw her grow up at arm's length. Whatever else the 18th century aristocracy permitted, and it permitted a very great deal, it did not permit that. Her sister Harriet is the other half of the story, and is almost never told. Harriet Spencer, who became Countess of Bessborough, was quieter, wittier, and if anything unluckier. She too married a cold man. She too gambled and hid the debts. She too bore a child to a lover and had to conceal it. And she was the one who nursed Georgiana at the end, and who wrote the letters describing it, and who lived on for another quarter of a century in a world where everybody who had loved her sister was dead. Two girls, born 3 years apart at Althorp, raised by loving parents in the calm and the pictures and the lime avenue, and both of them spent by the age of 50. She had been born in the calm grey house among the Northamptonshire fields, and she was buried far from it. And it is to the family she left behind, and to the very different brother who followed her, that we turn next. Georgiana's brother, who became the second Earl Spencer, was in almost every respect her opposite, and the contrast between the two of them brother and sister raised in the same nursery at Althorp by the same doting parents. It is one of the pleasures of this part of the story. Where she was extravagant, he was careful. Where she was famous, he was private. Where she gambled, he collected books. And where she poured herself into politics and was torn to pieces for it, he took high office and did his duty and left, and the country was better for it. His name was George John Spencer, born in the year 1758, a year after his sister. He was serious from boyhood, bookish, dutiful, a little stiff, deeply attached to his wife, and possessed of a conscience that his sister's creditors must sometimes have wished she had inherited a share of. And he did two things that placed him in the front rank of his generation. The first was to run the Royal Navy through the most dangerous decade in its history. He became First Lord of the Admiralty in 1794, when Britain was locked in the long war against revolutionary France that would run, with brief interruptions, for more than 20 years, and upon the Navy everything depended, because the Navy was the only thing standing between the island and an invading army. He held the post for 6 years, and they were terrible years, and he was good at it. He faced, almost at once, the great naval mutinies at Spithead and the Nore, when the fleets upon which the safety of the kingdom rested simply stopped obeying orders. He handled them with a mixture of concession and firmness that ended the crisis without destroying the navy. He oversaw the fleet through the battles of Cape St. Vincent and Camperdown, and in 1798 he made the decision for which sailors remember him, which was to reach past a good many senior and better connected officers, and give an independent squadron in the Mediterranean to an unconventional, insubordinate, one-armed rear admiral named Horatio Nelson, whose judgment he trusted when others did not. Nelson took that squadron to Egypt and destroyed the French fleet at anchor in Aboukir Bay, and the Battle of the Nile stranded Napoleon's army in the sand and changed the shape of the war. He was not a sailor and never pretended to be. He was an administrator with the nerve to back the right man. In the long history of that, he may be the member who did the most for his country. The second thing he did was to build the greatest private library in Europe, and here we find him in his true happiness. He inherited the 20,000 volumes of the bookish Sunderland, and he built upon them for 50 years with a passion and a purse that no rival could match. He hunted early, printing the Incunabula, the books produced before the year 1501, and he assembled them by the thousand. He bought the classics in first editions. He bought a Gutenberg Bible. He bought so relentlessly that the very word for competitive book buying entered the language from an auction in which he took part, when he pursued a rare early Italian printing of Boccaccio against a rival bidder to a price so absurd that the sale became a legend among collectors and gave its name to the mania. By the time he had finished, Althorp held something in the region of 40,000 volumes, and scholars came from across Europe to work in it, and it was reckoned without serious argument to be the finest library in private hands anywhere in the world. He had a librarian to look after it, who wrote enormous catalogues describing its treasures. The long library room at Althorp, lined from floor to ceiling, was one of the sights of England. Hold that in your mind, because it is going to matter later, and it is going to hurt. 2 centuries of Spencers had built that library, from the 17th century collector through to this quiet naval administrator who loved his books more than his office. It was the single most valuable thing the family possessed, more valuable than the pictures, more valuable perhaps than the house. And within a century of the second Earl's death it would be gone, sold entire, carted away in crates. And the reason it went is the reason so much went from so many English houses, and we shall come to it. The book sale that gave its name to the mania is worth telling. In the year 1812, the library of the late Duke of Roxburgh came under the hammer and in it was a small volume printed in Venice in 1471, an edition of Boccaccio of such rarity that no other copy was known. Lord Spencer wanted it. So did his own cousin, the Marquess of Blandford, of the Marlborough branch of the family. The two men bid against one another before a packed room, past every sane estimate, past every previous price ever paid for any printed book, until Blandford took it for £2,260, a sum that would have bought a considerable house. The bibliophiles present founded a club that evening to commemorate the occasion. 16 years later, Spencer bought the same volume at another sale for less than a third of the price. The naval mutinies of 1797 were the most frightening thing that happened to Britain during the whole of the French wars, and they nearly ended it. The seamen of the Channel Fleet at Spithead, and then the fleet at the Nore in the Thames estuary, refused duty. Their grievances were real and long-standing: wretched pay unchanged for a century, rotten provisions, no relief for the wounded. The Spithead men were disciplined and respectful and clear in what they wanted, and Spencer went down to Portsmouth himself and conceded most of it. The Nore mutiny went further, blockaded the river, and it had to be broken. Some of its leaders were hanged. It is not a comfortable episode, and the First Lord who handled it emerged with the fleet intact, and the men, on the whole, better treated. It is a curious thing that the second Earl Spencer, who did more for the safety of Britain than any other member of his family, is the one nobody has heard of. There is no monument to him in the popular memory, no statue, no legend. He backed the right admiral at the right moment and then went home to his books, and history has a way of remembering the man who fought the battle and forgetting the man who chose him for it. His sister is famous. His granddaughter's great-great-great-niece is famous beyond all measure. He catalogued incunabula in a long room in Northamptonshire, and he saved the fleet. He died in 1834, having served his country, saved his navy, buried his sister, and built his library. His son, the third Earl, would do something quite as consequential and rather less enjoyable, which was to force through the House of Commons the greatest constitutional reform in modern British history, while wishing every single day that he were at home in Northamptonshire looking at his cattle. And it is to that reluctant and thoroughly likeable man that we turn next. Of all the Spencers, the one I would most like to have met is the third Earl, and he would have been appalled to hear it, because he disliked being noticed almost as much as he disliked being in London, and he spent the whole of his public career trying to get back to his farm. His name was John Charles Spencer, and for most of his working life he was known by his courtesy title, Viscount Althorp, and to the House of Commons he was known simply as Althorp, and to the country at large, in the end, as Honest Jack. He was born in 1782. He was heavy, plain, awkward, a poor speaker who mumbled and lost his thread, and could not construct a peroration to save his life. He was passionately interested in cattle breeding, fox hunting, and improvement of pasture. He was no reader. He had no interest in ideas, no gift for phrases, and no ambition whatsoever. And he became the leader of the House of Commons at the most dangerous constitutional moment of the 19th century, and he carried the Great Reform Act, and he did it because the Commons believed him. That was all, it believed him. Here is why that mattered. By the 1820s, the electoral system of Britain had become an absurdity that everybody could see and nobody could fix. Great new industrial cities, like Manchester and Birmingham, containing hundreds of thousands of people, returned no members to Parliament at all. Meanwhile, a green mound in Wiltshire with no inhabitants whatever, and a ruined wall in Cornwall, and a stretch of land that had fallen into the sea, each returned 2 members, chosen by whichever landowner happened to control the handful of votes attached to them. These were the rotten boroughs, and there were dozens of them, and they were the private property of great families who bought and sold them and used them to seat their sons and their lawyers and their obedient friends. The Spencers themselves had held such seats. And beneath this, the country was changing with terrifying speed. The Industrial Revolution had thrown up a huge new urban population and a confident middle class who paid taxes and owned property and had no voice at all. In France, within living memory, a monarchy had gone to the guillotine. In 1830, France threw out another king. The English harvests failed. The agricultural labourers rioted and burned ricks across the southern counties, and the pressure for reform, which the governing class had resisted for 40 years, became irresistible and frightening. A Whig government came in, pledged to reform, and it needed somebody to manage the bill through the Commons. The task was probably the hardest in British parliamentary history. The bill would abolish the seats of the men who were being asked to vote for it. It required, night after night, month after month, holding together a majority of frightened, angry, self-interested men while the Tories fought every clause, and the Lords threw the whole thing out, and the country outside seethed and rioted, and in Bristol and Nottingham burned. Lord Althorp did it. He was not eloquent. He would rise and mumble and say what he thought in the plainest possible words and sit down. And it worked, because in that atmosphere of hysteria and manoeuvre, the House came to understand that this large, slow, honest man was incapable of telling it a lie. When Althorp said a thing was so, it was so. When he said the government would not concede a point, it would not. Members who despised the bill trusted the man carrying it. One political opponent said that Althorp's honesty was worth more to that government than the eloquence of any speaker in England, and it was simple truth. He held the Commons together for 18 months, and in June of the year 1832, the Reform Act became law, and the old corrupt system began to come down, and the long British transition toward a democratic franchise had its beginning. He hated every minute of it. His letters home are a continuous groan. He wanted to go and look at his shorthorn cattle. When his father died in 1834, and he succeeded as 3rd Earl Spencer, and was therefore obliged to leave the Commons for the Lords, he was so obviously and indecently delighted to be free of politics that his colleagues, whose government collapsed as a direct result of losing him, could hardly forgive it. He went home to Northamptonshire. He bred cattle. He served as president of an agricultural society. He was, by every account, blissfully happy. And he never held office again. There is one more thing, and it goes to the heart of what this family was. He came home to find the estate in difficulties, the debts of previous generations weighing on it, and he did what a Spencer of the old counting house instinct would do. He sold things. He economised. He set about putting the property straight and handing it on sound. It is very unglamorous, and it is exactly why Althorp survived when so many great houses did not. The country into which the Reform Bill was launched was frightened in a way that is difficult to recover now. In the autumn before it passed, agricultural labourers across the southern counties had risen in what were called the swing riots, burning ricks and smashing the new threshing machines that were taking their winter work, and signing their threatening letters with the name of a captain who did not exist. The government hanged 19 of them and transported 500 to Australia. In the cities, the reformers drilled and marched. When the House of Lords threw the bill out, the mob burned the Bishop's Palace at Bristol, and much of the centre of the city with it, and there were 3 days of rioting in Nottingham, where the castle was set alight. Men who had laughed at the idea of an English revolution stopped laughing. There is a story about Althorp that his colleagues told for the rest of their lives. In the middle of the reform crisis, when the government hung by a thread and the House was in an uproar and the fate of the bill turned on a single night's debate, the leader of the Commons was seen sitting on the front bench, entirely composed, reading a small book. A colleague leaned across to see what fortified him. It was a treatise on the management of cattle. It is worth being clear about how limited the Reform Act actually was, because it is easy to imagine that democracy arrived in the year 1832, and it did not. The new franchise gave the vote to perhaps one adult man in 5, and to no women whatever. The working men who had marched and rioted for the bill got nothing from it, and understood within a year that they had been used, and turned to the Chartist movement in their disappointment. What the Act did was destroy the rotten boroughs, give seats to the industrial towns, and establish for the first time that the composition of Parliament was a thing that could be altered by argument. Everything that followed over the next 100 years went through the door that Althorp held open. He died childless in 1845, and the title went sideways to a half-brother, and then in time to a nephew whose beard was so magnificently red that the whole of Ireland knew him by it. And it is to the Red Earl, and to the crisis that would cost the family its greatest treasure, that we turn next. John Point Spencer, 5th Earl Spencer, was a tall, imposing, courteous man, with a magnificent forked beard of a colour so vivid that it became his identity, and he is remembered in 2 countries for 2 entirely different reasons. In England, he is remembered as a great Victorian public servant, a friend and lieutenant of Gladstone, twice Viceroy of Ireland, First Lord of the Admiralty, a man who came within a whisker of the Premiership itself. In Ireland he is remembered, by a different sort of memory, as the Red Earl who governed the country in its bitterest years. He was born in 1835, and he served the Liberal cause for half a century with a steadiness and a decency that everybody, including his enemies, acknowledged. He was not brilliant. He was industrious, honourable, and entirely without vanity, and the central drama of his life was Ireland. He went there first as Viceroy in the 1860s, and returned 2 decades later in the middle of what were called the Land Wars, when the Irish tenantry, ground between bad harvests and rack rents and the long memory of the famine, rose against the landlord system, and the country slid towards something close to anarchy. Spencer's task was to hold Ireland down, and he did it with coercion acts and special courts and the machinery of a state that had run out of gentler ideas. He was hated for it. He was denounced in the Irish press and the American Irish press, and there was at least one plot to kill him. In the year 1882, within hours of a new chief secretary arriving in Dublin, that man and his deputy were murdered with knives in the Phoenix Park, a few hundred yards from where Spencer was walking, and he saw the commotion and did not know until later what he had seen. And yet, and this is the thing that lifts him, he came to believe the Irish were right, not about the murders, about the country. He worked it through slowly, over years, in the honest, plodding way that was his nature, and he arrived at the conclusion that Ireland could not be governed against the will of its people, and that Home Rule, an Irish Parliament in Dublin managing Irish affairs, was the only just and workable answer. When Gladstone declared for Home Rule in 1886, splitting the Liberal Party and destroying his own government, the Red Earl, the man who had jailed Irishmen without number, stood with him. It cost him friends, and it cost him the party's unity, and it very likely cost him the office of Prime Minister, which was within his reach twice, and which twice slipped away. He was, in short, a decent man who changed his mind in public at great cost, which is rarer in politics than genius. Now to the loss. The estates, like nearly every landed estate in Britain, were in trouble by the 1880s, and the cause was a slow catastrophe called the Great Depression of British agriculture. Steamships and railways had opened the American prairies, and cheap grain came flooding across the Atlantic, and English wheat prices collapsed and never recovered. Rents fell, tenants failed, and the whole aristocratic edifice, built for 4 centuries upon agricultural rent, began quietly to crack. This family, whose fortune had literally begun with the produce of English grass, discovered that English grass was no longer enough. The Red Earl was in debt. He had spent heavily in public service, as viceroys did, keeping up a semi-royal state in Dublin out of his own pocket. The rents were failing, and he possessed, sitting in a long room in a house in Northamptonshire, the most valuable single asset of its kind in the world. In the year 1892 he sold the Althorp library, all of it, the 40-odd thousand volumes, the Incunabula, the Gutenberg Bible, the Caxtons, 3 centuries of accumulation by a family of collectors, went in a single private transaction to a woman named Enriqueta Rylands, who was building a library in Manchester as a memorial to her late husband. She paid something over £200,000. The crates went north, and the John Rylands Library in Manchester, which stands there yet, and which is one of the treasures of England and open to anybody who cares to walk in, is very largely the Spencer Library under another roof. I find I cannot be sorry about where the books went, and I cannot help being sorry that they went. The long room at Althorp was emptied. The scholars stopped coming. The family had sold its mine to keep its land, and it was the right decision, and it was a small death. The island that the Red Earl governed was a country in the middle of a slow social revolution, and the instrument of it was rent. Most Irish land was owned by a small class of largely Protestant landlords, and farmed by a vast population of Catholic tenants who held no security whatever, who could be turned out at the will of the owner, and whose improvements to the land became the landlord's property when they went. Against that system the Land League organised the weapon that has carried an Irish land agent's name into every language in Europe, the collective refusal to deal with a man at all, to serve him, speak to him, or sell to him. Captain Boycott was that agent. The word is his monument, and the campaign it names broke the landlord system within a generation. There is a photograph of the Red Earl in old age that I have never been able to forget, taken in the garden at Althorp, an immense bearded figure in a heavy coat, looking not at all like a man who governed Ireland, but like a farmer at the end of a long day. He outlived his usefulness to his party, and he outlived his own health, suffering a stroke that ended his public life just as the Liberals returned to power, so that the great office he had twice come near to holding passed to somebody else while he sat at home. He died in 1910. The books he sold have been consulted by 2 million people since. The house he saved by selling them is standing. The books themselves went north in a manner that seems almost casual, given what they were. They were packed and carted, and taken by rail to Manchester, where they were housed in a new building of red sandstone, an extraordinary neo-Gothic cathedral of a library that Enriqueta Rylands was raising in memory of her husband, a cotton magnate. She opened it to the public on the first day of the 20th century. It is free. Anybody may walk in off the street in the middle of a Manchester afternoon and sit in that immense vaulted room and ask to see a book printed in Venice 500 years ago. Whatever the family lost, the country gained, and I do not think a single volume of it has been valued less for having moved. That is the shape of things now, and it will be the shape for 100 years. The Spencers, having climbed for 4 centuries by accumulation, would spend the next century in a slow, controlled retreat, selling to survive, giving up a little to keep the rest, always with an eye on the one thing that mattered, which was that the house and the land should pass to the next generation. And the century about to open would test that resolve almost to destruction, with 2 wars, a revolution in taxation, and the near extinction of the world these people had been built for. And it is to that long 20th century siege that we turn next. Before we walk into the 20th century, and into the wars and the taxes that would nearly finish the world we have been describing, I want to stop the clock for a while and simply show you the house at its height, because it is worth seeing, and because the people who lived in it had no notion that it was a height and thought it would go on forever. So it is a Saturday in autumn, in the last years before the old Queen died, and Althorp is full. The house party has been arriving all afternoon, brought from the station in carriages, and the servants have been carrying up the luggage, which is enormous, because a lady staying 4 days will require perhaps a dozen changes of clothes, and has brought her own maid to manage them. There are perhaps 20 guests, but below stairs, and in the stable block, and in the kitchens, and the still room, and the lamp room, and the brushing room, there are getting on for 50 servants, and during a shooting party a good many more, and the household at that moment is a village. Think of the machinery of it. Every fire in every hearth is laid and lit and fed by hand, and there may be 30 of them. Every lamp is trimmed and filled with oil, and carried to its place and taken away in the morning to be cleaned. Each jug of hot water for each washstand is carried up the back stairs. The bells ring in the corridor below, and the footmen look at the board to see which bell has rung and go up. And in the kitchens the cook and her army are producing, for the guests, 4 heavy meals a day of many courses, cooked on coal ranges, in copper pans, with no refrigeration beyond an ice house in the park stocked in winter from the frozen lake. Upstairs the guests are doing very little, and doing it with tremendous style. The men shoot, walking the coverts with a loader behind them, and the birds are driven over them by beaters recruited from the estate villages, and the bag at the end of the day is counted and recorded in a book. The ladies walk out to meet them for a luncheon carried down in hampers. In the afternoon there is tea, an elaborate meal in its own right, and then everyone goes upstairs and changes into evening dress, and there is dinner at 8, and afterwards the ladies withdraw, and the men sit over their port, and then later there are cards and music at the piano, and the whole company goes to bed at midnight, and the servants clear the rooms and lay tomorrow's fires, and get to bed at 1, and rise at 5. And around them, in every room, hangs the accumulated evidence of 400 years of a family's climb. The Van Dycks in the picture gallery, the Rubens, Reynolds and Gainsborough, the Marlborough silver on the sideboard, the porcelain, the long gallery where the books had been, now differently filled, portrait after portrait of Spencer's, the men in armour and in wigs, and in the plain dark coats of the 19th century, the women in silk, generation after generation, looking down from the walls at their descendants, eating dinner beneath them. The estate outside runs to many thousands of acres. There are tenant farms and cottages and a village school and a church where the family sits in its own pew, and beneath which its dead lie in the vault, and everybody for miles around is in some fashion connected with the house, works for it, rents from it, is doctored or schooled or buried by its charity. It is a small kingdom, and the family at the centre of it are, in a way that we have entirely lost the ability to feel, the fixed point of an entire community's world. They are also, though nobody says so aloud, running short of money, and they know it. The agricultural rents that pay for all this have been falling for 20 years. The great library has already gone to Manchester, and the political ground is shifting under the whole class, as a new kind of taxation begins to be discussed in London, aimed squarely at inherited wealth. The word for it, when it came, was death duties, and they were introduced in the 1890s, and at first they were modest and the great families paid them without much complaint. Nobody understood yet what they would become. When a landed estate passed from father to son, the state would take a percentage of its value, and since the value was in land and pictures and houses rather than in cash, the percentage had to be found by selling something. In the 1890s it was a nuisance. Within 50 years it would be an amputation, and it would be performed on nearly every great house in England, some of which did not survive the operation. And there was another thing coming, worse and closer, that would take from such places something no tax could touch, which was their sons. In the hall at Althorp, and in 100 halls like it, the young men who were shooting pheasants that Saturday afternoon had perhaps 15 years to live, and about 1 in 5 of them would die in France or Belgium before they were 30. The world you are looking at, the servants and the shooting parties and the long-ordered days, is standing in the last of its own sunlight and does not know it. And the household had a hierarchy as intricate as anything at court. At its head stood the butler and the housekeeper, who between them ruled 2 separate kingdoms and dined apart from their staff in the housekeeper's room, waited upon by juniors. Beneath them came the ladies' maids and the valets, who belonged to their master or mistress rather than to the house, and who therefore floated above the ordinary servants in a haze of borrowed status. Then the footmen, chosen for their height and matched in pairs like carriage horses. Then the housemaids, who were required to have finished the ground floor rooms and vanished before any member of the family came down, so that the work of the house appeared to be done by no one. Then the kitchen maids and the scullery maids, and at the very bottom the boy who cleaned the boots and the knives and lit the fires at 5:30 in the morning in the dark. And the estate was not only the house. Radiating out from it were the tenanted farms, each with its own farmhouse and buildings and family, paying rent at Michaelmas and Lady Day. There were woodlands managed on a rotation of decades for timber and cover. There was a home farm run directly to supply the kitchens with milk and beef and vegetables. There were cottages for the estate workers, the carpenters and masons and gamekeepers and gardeners who kept the whole apparatus standing, and a sawmill, and a brickyard perhaps, and a laundry. There were almshouses, and every one of those buildings was an asset that produced a little income and consumed a good deal of maintenance, and the agent who managed it all reported to the Earl once a week with a ledger, and the shooting itself was an industry. The birds that rose over the guns had been reared from eggs by the keepers, fed and watched and protected from foxes and poachers through the summer, and the coverts had been planted decades before in precisely the places that would send the birds highest and fastest across the line of guns on the day. Nothing about it was wild. It was a landscape engineered over generations for a single autumn morning, and the Earl who planted a covert in 1860 was thinking about the flight of pheasants in 1900, and the trees he put in are standing yet. And here is what strikes me most about it. Nobody in that house on that autumn Saturday, not the Earl at the head of the table, nor the boy cleaning the boots at 5:30 in the morning, imagined that the arrangement was temporary. It had the solidity of the seasons. Their grandfathers had lived so, and their grandchildren would, and the land would yield its rents, and the servants would come from the village as they always had, and the birds would go over the guns each October until the end of the world. Within 40 years almost every part of it would be gone. And it is into that ending, and how the Spencers came through it when so many did not, that we turn next. The 20th century took the English country house apart, and how Althorp came through it is, in a sense, the story of an entire class, played out on a single hillside. The first blow was the War of 1914. It fell upon the landed families with a particular ferocity, because their sons went into the infantry as junior officers, and junior infantry officers were required to lead from the front, and they were killed at a rate far above that of the men they led. The gentry and aristocracy of Britain lost 1/5 of the young men who served, and in some regiments and some families the proportion was worse. Go into any English village church and read the names on the memorial, and you will find, at the top of the list, the son of the big house. They were more fortunate than many. The direct line survived. But the wider family and the world of the house did not come through unmarked. And neither did the estate, because war meant taxation, and taxation, once raised, is very seldom lowered. Income tax, which had been a shilling or so in the pound before the war, ended it many times higher. Death duties climbed, And the agricultural depression that had begun in the 1870s simply went on and on. Land, which for centuries had been the one certain foundation of an English fortune, had become a liability that ate money. So the great sales began. In the years around 1920, English landowners sold something like a quarter of the entire land surface of the country in what was the largest transfer of property since the dissolution of the monasteries. Estates were broken up. Tenants bought their farms. The London mansions of the aristocracy, those enormous palaces in Mayfair and Piccadilly, were pulled down one after another and replaced by hotels and offices. Devonshire House, where Georgiana had held her salon and made and unmade ministries, was demolished in 1924. Spencer House, the family's great London palace, was let, and then let again, and the family never lived in it as a home in that way again. And when the Second War came, the houses themselves were requisitioned. Great rooms that had held 4 centuries of accumulation were filled with school children, or soldiers, or hospital beds, or filing cabinets. Parkland was ploughed, railings went for scrap, and when it was over, the owners came back to find their houses damaged and their staff gone forever, because the young women who had been housemaids in 1939 had spent the war in factories and services and had discovered that there were other things to do with a life. That was the true end of it, and it was not the taxes. It was that the servants did not come back. A place like Althorp had been designed, built, and lived in on the assumption of unlimited cheap labour. Every fire, every lamp, each meal, each acre of polished floor assumed it. Take that away, and the house becomes physically unusable by an ordinary family, a great, cold, beautiful machine with nobody to run it. In the 30 years after the Second War, something like 1,000 English country houses were demolished, not sold, demolished, blown up, pulled down, sold for the lead on the roof and the stone in the walls, because their owners could not pay the tax and could not run the house and could find nobody who wanted to buy it. One a week, for 30 years, went to the wreckers. It is one of the great cultural losses in British history, and it happened quietly in the countryside while everybody was looking at other things. Althorp survived, and it survived for reasons that would have been perfectly familiar to the sheep farmers who founded it. The family sold what it had to sell, and kept what it had to keep, and counted. They gave up land, thousands of acres. Pictures went, quietly, and some of them very fine ones. Plate and books and furniture followed. Each generation coming into the inheritance faced the same arithmetic, that a proportion of everything must go to the state, and the state wanted cash, and so a Van Dyke went across the Atlantic, or a farm passed to the man who had been renting it. It is a slow amputation of a body that is otherwise perfectly healthy, and it went on decade after decade, and they opened the house. In the years after the Second War, the great families discovered that the paying public, which they had been keeping firmly on the other side of the park wall for 400 years, might now be the thing that saved them. Tickets, guided tours, the gift shop and the tea room in the old stables. It was a humiliation of a mild and profitable sort, and it worked, and the houses that swallowed their pride survived, and a good many that did not. Spencer House in London deserves a paragraph of elegy. It was built by the first Earl in the 1750s overlooking Green Park, and it was reckoned then and is reckoned now among the most beautiful private houses ever raised in the capital, a palace in the purest Palladian taste, with a painted room that visitors travelled to see. The family lived in it for 170 years, and then the arithmetic of the 20th century closed around it. In the 1920s, the contents began to move out to Althorp. In the Second War, the house was requisitioned. Afterwards, it was let to a nursing association, then to auctioneers, then to offices. It survived, which is more than Devonshire House managed, and it is beautiful still, and it has been magnificently restored. But no Spencer has made a home in it for 100 years. The demolitions were not always tragic, and they were seldom dramatic. A house would stand empty for a few years, its windows boarded, dry rot moving quietly through the joists. A sale would be held on the lawn, and the contents would go, the library in lots, the chimney pieces prized out, the panelling bought by an American buyer and shipped across the Atlantic. The lead came off the roof because lead had value and because a roofless house paid no rates. And then the weather came in, and after a winter or two the walls were pulled down and the stone sold for hardcore, and a farmer ploughed the site. And within 20 years nothing remained but a lodge on a lane leading to nothing at all. The Spencers did one more thing that saved them, and it is the least romantic item in this whole story, which is that they had it valued and they planned. Where an unlucky family met the death duties as a sudden calamity, having made no arrangement and having to sell in a hurry into a falling market, a prudent one knew the figures years ahead, knew which fields it could bear to lose and which pictures the nation would never let leave the country, and negotiated. Some works were accepted by the state in lieu of tax. Some were sold privately, quietly, at a decent price rather than in a panic. It is the counting house instinct again, 400 years after the wool barn, and it is the reason the Lime Avenue is still there. Through it all, at Althorp, the family stayed. The house was never sold, never demolished, never given away. The Lime Avenue stood. The pictures, thinned but glorious, stayed on the walls. And in the middle of that grim century, one particular Earl Spencer set himself to the task of understanding, cataloguing, and preserving what was left, and he was helped by a wife whose own history takes us, at last, and rather unexpectedly, to a house on the edge of a royal estate in Norfolk. And it is to them, and to that house, that we turn next. Albert Edward John Spencer, 7th Earl Spencer, whom everybody called Jack, inherited Althorp in 1922 and held it for more than half a century, and he was in his own quiet way one of the most important men in the whole of this story, though he did nothing whatever that a historian of politics would notice. What he did was save the collection. He was a scholar of his own possessions. He went through the house room by room, over decades, identifying pictures that had been misattributed or forgotten, hanging, researching, cataloguing, correcting the errors of generations of casual custodianship. He knew what everything was and where it had come from and what it was worth, and he knew which was rarer, what mattered most and must never on any account be sold. He was, in the tradition of the family, careful with money to the point of parsimony, disliking waste, keeping the house going through the lean decades by the simple expedient of not spending anything he did not have to spend. Under him, Althorp went through the great dying of the country houses and came out the other side intact. He married in the first year after the war Lady Cynthia Hamilton, and she brings into our story, for the first time in a very long while, the crown. Cynthia Spencer was by every account one of the loveliest and best-liked women of her generation, gentle, gracious, and generous, and she was the sort of person whom nobody ever seems to have said a hard word about. She worked all her life for hospitals and nursing and the Red Cross. She was adored on the estate, and she became a lady of the bedchamber to the Queen, that is to say to Queen Elizabeth, the wife of King George VI, whom later generations would know as the Queen Mother, and she remained her friend and attendant for many years. Now, this was nothing new for that family, and that is precisely the point I want to make. The family had been in and around the royal household for centuries. Its women had been ladies of the bedchamber and mistresses of the robes to a long line of queens. We'll go back to the Stuarts. Its men had held court offices. They were not royalty and never had been, but they belonged permanently and comfortably to the small circle of great families whose members surrounded the monarch, who were in and out of the palaces, who were known by their Christian names to kings. There is another thread too, older and stranger. Through various lines of descent, the Spencers carried in their veins the blood of the Stuart kings by way of the illegitimate children of Charles II, whose descendants were folded through marriage into the English aristocracy until half the peerage could trace a line back to that shrewd and pleasure-loving monarch. They had several such lines. It is a curiosity that would be pointed out, endlessly and to the family's mild irritation, at a certain wedding in the year 1981, when it was noticed that the bride had more English royal blood in her than the bridegroom did. So when we come, in a moment, to the marriage that made this family a household name across the world, we ought to understand that in the eyes of the two families concerned, it was not the fairy tale that the newspapers wanted of a commoner marrying a prince. It was something much more ordinary and much older. It was two families who had known each other for 300 years and whose houses stood a mile apart, arranging a match as such families had always done. Because that is the last thing Jack and Cynthia bring us, and it is the hinge of everything that follows. Their son and his family would come to live at Park House. Park House stands on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, which is the private country property of the British royal family, where they go for Christmas and the shooting. It is a comfortable, unpretentious Victorian house of 10 bedrooms, and the king leased it to the Spencers, because the Spencers were the sort of people to whom one leased such a house, being old friends and courtiers and neighbours of long standing. And so in the 1950s and 60s, a family of Spencer children grew up in a house at the edge of the Queen's Park, playing in the grounds, swimming in the pool, walking across to the big house when the royal family were in residence, knowing the Queen's children as the ordinary neighbours that they were. The youngest daughter of that family was born in that house on the 1st of July in 1961. She would grow up, in short, next door. The habit of royal service went very deep, and it went back a very long way. A Spencer had carried the sword at a coronation. Spencer women had held the great household offices, mistress of the robes and lady of the bedchamber, under Queen Anne and under the George and under Victoria, which meant that they dressed the Queen and slept near her and travelled with her, and were among the very few people permitted to speak to her without being spoken to first. It was not a job in any modern sense. It was a form of belonging, and it meant that for something like 300 years, at almost any given moment, there was a Spencer somewhere in the private apartments of an English monarch, handing over a glove. Jack Spencer's parsimony passed into legend on the estate, and the stories are affectionate. He is supposed to have gone round the house at night turning off lights. He wore his clothes until they gave out. He was not a mean man, and he gave generously where he thought it mattered, and he simply could not bear waste, having watched what the century was doing to houses like his. In the years when other owners were selling a Rembrandt to buy a yacht, he was going through the muniment room in an overcoat because the heating was off, identifying a picture that 3 generations had walked past without knowing what it was. He handed on the collection intact. It is not a heroic way to spend 50 years, and it was exactly the right one. Cynthia Spencer's memorial on the estate is a small one, and the affection behind it was not. She had gone about the villages for 40 years, knowing the families, calling on the sick, opening the fetes, and when she died in 1972, the tenants and the workers subscribed to a window in the church. Her granddaughter, who was 11, was said afterwards to have thought of her as the perfect model of what a woman of that family should be, and to have measured herself unhappily against the memory. It is a strange thing to be a child in a house full of ancestors. Every one of them has been finished and judged and hung on the wall in a good light, and the child is the only unfinished thing in the building. And it is to the man who was her father, and to the young woman he married, that we turn next. Edward John Spencer, known to everybody as Johnny, was born in 1924, the son of Jack and Cynthia, and he was in most respects an entirely conventional English aristocrat of his generation. They went to Eton and to Sandhurst, served in the Royal Scots Greys during the Second War, and afterwards spent some years as an equerry, first to King George VI and then to the young Queen Elizabeth II, which is to say he was a gentleman in attendance, a member of the royal household, exactly as his mother had been before him. He was pleasant, easy-going, not intellectual, fond of the countryside and of photography and of his dogs. Everyone who met him seems to have liked him. In the year 1954, he married Frances Roche, and she was 18 years old. Her side of the family is worth a sentence, because it is not the same sort of thing at all. The Roches were Anglo-Irish, holders of a barony, but Frances's mother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, was a woman of a rather different stamp, a talented pianist from a Scottish family of no particular grandeur, who had married into the peerage, and who was, like Cynthia Spencer before her, a close friend and lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. The two grandmothers, in other words, were both in service to the same royal lady, and both would live to see what came of the marriage they had, in their different ways, encouraged. She was 18. Johnny was 30. She was married in Westminster Abbey with the Queen among the guests, and it was called the Wedding of the Year, and photographs of it show a bride who looks exactly as young as she was. They went to live at Park House on the Sandringham estate, and there they had their children, and there the marriage came apart, and the two things happened at the same time and in the same rooms. The children came quickly, Sarah in 1955, Jane in 1957, and then a son who came very ill into the world and who lived only a few hours and was buried, and about whom in the way of that generation and that class almost nothing was ever said. He was called John. I want to stop on that, because everything that follows in this family runs out of it. A son was what was wanted. A son was what the whole apparatus of this 500-year story required, because the earldom and Althorp and the pictures and the land all passed to a son, and there was no other way for them to pass, and the son had died, and in the aftermath there was, in that house, a good deal of unspoken and unhealed grief, and a good deal of pressure on a young woman in her 20s who had been made to feel, in ways both open and unspoken, that she had failed at the one thing she had been married to do. She was sent for medical examinations to discover what was wrong with her. It did not apparently occur to anybody that the fault might lie elsewhere. The next child, born on the 1st of July in 1961, was another daughter. They had not chosen a girl's name, and it took them some days to settle on one. She was christened Diana Frances Spencer. 3 years later, the longed-for boy arrived at last, Charles, and the succession was safe, and the marriage was not. It ended in the way such marriages ended in that decade, slowly and then all at once. Frances left at 32 and went to London, and in time she married again. And the divorce, when it came, was bitter, and it was public, and it went against her. There was a custody battle for the children, and Frances lost it, and the detail of it which is always mentioned, because it explains everything, is that her own mother, Lady Fermoy, gave evidence against her in favour of Johnny. The children stayed at Park House with their father. They were 4, 6, 10, and 12, thereabouts. And they lived afterwards the divided lives of children of that arrangement in the big cold house on the edge of the Royal Park, with a father who loved them and did not know how to talk to them, and a mother in London whom they visited, and a great deal of silence in between. Diana was 6, Her brother Charles has written of listening at night to her crying. This is the moment where the sheep and the graziers and the earls and the library and the long ascent of a family arrive at an ordinary suburban wound, the kind that happens in 10,000 houses a year, and it happened in this one, and it fell on a small girl who would grow up to be the most photographed person on earth. Park House itself was, by the standards of what these children would later know, an ordinary sort of place, and it is remembered by all of them with an affection that Althorp never earned. It had 10 bedrooms and a heated outdoor swimming pool, and a cricket lawn and a stable yard, and there were guinea pigs and rabbits and a succession of cats, and the children were allowed to run about in it in a way that children in a great show house are not. The royal children were sometimes there. It was a childhood of Norfolk skies and wet sand and long grass, and it lasted until the year the marriage ended, and after that the same rooms held the same objects, and were not the same house at all. A word about Frances, because she has been treated badly by history, and by the press, and by a good deal of what has been written about her daughter. She was 18 when she married, and 32 when she left, and in the England of 1967, a woman who left her husband, whatever her reasons, forfeited very nearly everything, and she did. She lost the children in a courtroom in which her own mother spoke against her. She was portrayed for the rest of her life as the bolter. She went to Scotland eventually, and lived quietly, and worked, and was reconciled with her children, and she outlived her second daughter by 7 years. Then the old man at Althorp died, and Johnny succeeded to the earldom, and the children were taken away from the Norfolk sky to a very much colder and more magnificent place. And it is to what they found there, and to the woman who came after their mother, that we turn next. To move from Park House to Althorp was to move from a comfortable home into a great historic monument, and the children, who had been the family in the small house, discovered that at the big house they were something else. They were the current occupants of a museum. Diana was 13 when they moved, and by her own later account, she never loved Althorp, never felt it as a home, and preferred the memory of the ordinary house in Norfolk with the pool and the garden. Johnny, now the 8th Earl, inherited the usual arithmetic. His father had held the estate together for 50 years by spending nothing. Now the death duties fell due once again, as they had fallen on his father and his grandfather, and once again a proportion of 500 years of accumulation had to be converted into cash and handed to the state. And Johnny, unlike his careful father, is not a man of business. In the year 1976 he married again. Her name was Rain, and she was the daughter of the romantic novelist Barbara Cartland, and she had been, until her own divorce, the Countess of Dartmouth. She was energetic, decisive, immensely capable, and entirely undaunted, and she arrived at Althorp and took hold of the place with both hands. What happened next has been argued about within that family and outside it ever since, and I am going to set it out as fairly as I can, because there are 2 accounts and they are both held sincerely. The first account is the children's, and it is the one that has been most heard. They regarded her as an intruder who had displaced their mother's memory and taken possession of their father. They resented her redecoration of the house, which was extensive, and above all they were appalled by the sales. Because Rain, confronting the debts, sold things. Pictures went, some of them very fine. Furniture went. Books, plate, objects, the accumulated matter of centuries, went out of Althorp in the late 1970s and early 80s, and the proceeds paid the duties and the repairs and the roof. The children believed the family's patrimony was being dismantled and sold off around them, and their feeling about it was not mild. Diana's brother Charles has never much disguised his view. The second account is Rain's, and it deserves to be heard too. When she arrived, the house was in real trouble. The roof leaked, the heating did not work, there was serious debt, and there were duties to pay, and the estate could not pay them out of income, any more than the Red Earl's estate could in 1892. And so, exactly as the Red Earl had done, she sold the movable to save the immovable. She also opened the house to the public, professionally and profitably, put in a proper shop and a restaurant, restored rooms that had been shut up for decades, and repaired a building that was quietly rotting. Whatever else is true, Althorp was in better physical condition when she left it than when she came. Both accounts are true. That is what makes it painful. A family's treasures are also a family's memory, and to sell them is to sell the past to buy the future, and there is no version of that transaction which does not hurt. The Spencers had been making it, one way or another, since 1892, and every generation since had told itself it was the last time. Then in 1978, Johnny collapsed with a massive cerebral hemorrhage, and for months he lay near death, and Rain sat by him and fought for him with a tenacity that even her stepchildren did not deny, and by a good deal of will and some experimental treatment he lived, though he was never entirely the same man again. He had 8 more years of life, and a good deal of that was her doing. And in the middle of this, in the middle of a house being sold off around her, and a father who had nearly died, and a stepmother she could not accept, and a mother she saw at intervals, the third of the 4 children finished at her boarding school with no examinations passed to speak of, went to Switzerland briefly, came home, and moved to London, where she shared a flat with friends and worked, at various points, as a nanny, a cleaner for her sister, and an assistant at a kindergarten in Pimlico. She was, by every account of everybody who knew her then, sweet, funny, unacademic, unpretentious and rather shy, and she liked small children, and she went to the ballet, and she waited, as girls of her sort did, for something to happen. In the summer of 1980, at a house party in Sussex, she sat beside the Prince of Wales, and they talked. Rain's own background is worth a moment, because it explains a good deal about the reception she got. Her mother was Barbara Cartland, who wrote something like 700 romantic novels, dressed entirely in pink, and was one of the most successful and most mocked women in Britain. To the old aristocracy, this was not merely vulgar, it was contagiously vulgar. Rain had made her own way in public life through London local government, where she served for years with real competence on committees that nobody glamorous wanted, and she had a genuine and unfashionable passion for the preservation of historic buildings. None of it counted. She was Barbara Cartland's daughter, and she had married into a house full of Van Dykes, and the stepchildren had a name for her that I will not repeat. There is a detail from those London years that people always remember, which is that when the engagement was announced, the newspapers discovered that the future Princess of Wales had been employed, briefly, cleaning her sister's flat for £1 an hour. It was true. It was also, in its way, entirely characteristic of the family, that this old habit of unembarrassed practicality that runs from the sheep farmer down through the counting-house earls to a girl in a headscarf pushing a vacuum cleaner. The Spencers had never really pretended that work was beneath them. They had simply, for 400 years, employed other people to do it. Johnny himself remains hard to see clearly, obscured by everything that came afterwards. He was a countryman who liked his camera and his dogs and disliked argument. He had been raised by a father who spoke to him about pictures and a mother who was beloved by everybody, and he had not the least idea how to speak to his own children about anything that mattered. He loved them. They knew he loved them. And there was a silence in that house on every subject of consequence that none of them was equipped to break, and it lasted, in one form or another, for the rest of his life. And it is to what came of that conversation, and to what the world made of the girl from Park House, that we turn next. The engagement was announced in the February of the year 1981, and she was 19 years old. Consider, for a moment, what 19 means. She had left school without qualifications. She had been working with small children. She had never held a job of consequence, never lived alone, never spoken in public, never given an interview. She had grown up next to the royal family and knew them as neighbours, and had no more conception than any of us of what it would be to be one of them. And the man she was to marry was 13 years older, and had been Prince of Wales since he was 9. She was, in the phrase everybody used at the time, and which reads very oddly now, entirely suitable. She was Lady Diana Spencer, of an ancient family, a daughter of an earl, granddaughter of 2 ladies-in-waiting to the Queen Mother, raised on the Sandringham estate. She had, as the genealogists gleefully pointed out, more English royal blood than her fiancé, whose ancestry was largely German and Danish. There was no whisper of anything in her past to embarrass anybody. The families had known each other for centuries. On paper, in the old language of the great houses, it was a perfectly ordinary and rather good match. Nothing about it was ordinary. From the moment of the announcement, the attention that fell upon her was of a kind and a scale that no private person in Britain had ever endured, and it did not stop for the rest of her life. Photographers waited outside her flat. They followed her to the kindergarten. It was constant, and it was relentless, and she was 19, and she had nobody to teach her how to bear it, and nobody in truth knew how, because nothing quite like it had happened before. They were married on the 29th of July in 1981 in St. Paul's Cathedral, and it was watched, they said afterwards, by 750 million people around the world, which was at that time the largest audience for anything in the history of the species. Her dress had a train 25 feet long, and she came up the aisle on her father's arm, and Johnny Spencer, 3 years after the hemorrhage that nearly killed him, walked the whole length of that cathedral with his daughter, slowly holding on, and reached the altar. And a great many people who watched it remember that walk more than they remember anything else in the day. At the top of the aisle stood the Archbishop, who told the congregation and the world that this was the stuff of which fairy tales are made. The family had reached the summit at last. 473 years after John Spencer bought a sheep farm in Northamptonshire, a daughter of that house had married the heir to the throne of England, and a son would be king. There was no rung above this one. There is nowhere further to climb, and the fairy tale was not one. I am going to say what happened next plainly, and without lingering, because a great deal has been written about this marriage by people who were not in it, and because the two concerned are not a subject for entertainment. The marriage was unhappy almost from the start. They were mismatched in age, in temperament, in interests, and in expectation. He was not in love with her in the way that she needed, and she was not equipped for the life she had entered, and each of them, in different ways, was unhappy and made the other unhappy. She suffered for years from a serious eating disorder, which she later spoke about openly, and which very few people around her understood at the time. There was another person in the marriage which she said in a famous interview, and she was right. There was press attention of a savagery that has few parallels, and she was, for a long time, extremely lonely inside the most photographed life on earth. The work she did was not decorative, and it is worth being exact about it. In the middle of the 1980s, when a new and frightening illness had appeared, and much of the public believed it could be caught from a cup or a handshake, and when patients were dying in isolation because nurses were afraid and families had turned away, she opened a ward for such patients in a London hospital, and she sat down on a bed, and she took a man's bare hand in her own bare hand while the cameras watched. It was a calculated act, and she knew exactly what she was doing. It was reported everywhere, and a great many people watching it at home quietly revised what they had believed that morning. Very few politicians in that decade did anything half so useful. 2 sons were born in 1982 and 1984. She loved them without qualification, and she raised them as differently from the royal pattern as she could manage, taking them to see things that princes did not usually see, hugging them in front of cameras, sending them to school in the ordinary way. And it is not for me to say more than that about men who are living, except that everything they have since said about her suggests she got that part right. And she made herself, in the middle of all of it, into something no one had predicted. She took the attention that was destroying her, and she turned it deliberately on things that needed to be seen. She sat on the beds of men dying of a disease that the world was frightened to touch, and held their hands without gloves in front of the cameras, and shifted the way an entire generation thought about it. She went to hospices and to shelters and to leper hospitals. She walked, at the end of her life, through a partially cleared minefield in Angola, in a visor and a flak jacket, so that the photographers would follow her and photograph the mines, and the campaign to ban them gathered force, and it succeeded. She had grown up in a family that had spent 500 years accumulating, and she spent her fame giving it away. They separated in 1992. In the same year, her father Johnny died at Althorp, and her brother Charles became the 9th Earl Spencer. The divorce was completed in 1996. Her second great campaign came at the very end, and it was against landmines. She flew to Angola that January and walked, in a protective visor and a heavy flak jacket, along a cleared path through a live minefield. And she visited a hospital where children who had lost their legs to those mines were learning to use crutches. She was criticised at home by politicians who said it was not her business. She went on to Bosnia in the summer and did it again. She had understood something quite precise about her own position, which was that the cameras would go wherever she went and would photograph whatever she was standing next to, and that she could therefore point them, like a lamp, at whatever she chose. It is only fair to say something about the man she married, and I will say it briefly, and without taking a side. He was in his 30s, and had been raised from birth for a role that has no job description and no exit, watched, criticised, and prevented by the Constitution from doing anything of consequence. He had interests that the country found faintly ridiculous at the time, and takes seriously now. He had been pushed toward the marriage by everybody around him, and he was not in love, and he said so privately, and the machinery went forward anyway. 2 unhappy people can make each other very unhappy indeed, without either of them being a villain, and it is not for a narrator at this distance to sit in judgment upon a marriage neither of them ever meant to conduct in public. And it is to the last of it, and to the island in the lake, that we turn next. On the last day of August, in the year 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in a car accident in Paris. She was 36 years old. That is the whole of what I am going to tell you about it, because there is nothing in the detail of it that anybody needs at this hour of the night, and because it has been picked over enough. She was 36. It was sudden. It was an accident, and it took her. What followed in Britain was a week unlike any other in living memory, a strange, overwhelming, and not entirely explicable outpouring from a country that had thought itself reserved. Flowers were laid outside the London palaces in drifts, a foot deep and then a yard deep, hundreds of thousands of bouquets, until the scent of them carried across the parks. People queued through the night to sign books of condolence. The crowd stood 10 deep along the route on the day of the funeral, and the strangest thing about that day, to everyone who stood in it, was the silence, because 1 million people were standing in the streets of London and hardly anybody was making a sound. At the funeral, her brother stood up and spoke, and what he said was neither conventional nor comfortable, and it was heard in that silence. And then something happened that had never happened at a royal funeral in the history of England, which was that the crowd outside, listening on the speakers, began to applaud, and the sound came in through the doors of the abbey and rolled up the nave, and everybody inside heard it coming, and then they took her home. The cortege drove north out of London, up the motorway, and people stood on every bridge and threw flowers down onto the roof of the hearse until the driver had to use the wipers. It went on for 70-odd miles, and it turned in at last through the gates of a park in Northamptonshire and came up a long avenue of lime trees, past the deer, to the house at the end of it. There is a lake at Althorp, called the Round Oval, and in the middle of it there is a small wooded island. It cannot be reached except by boat. Her brother chose it, and she was buried there on the island in the water, in the middle of the park that her family had held for 500 years. Nobody visits. There is a memorial on the shore where people may stand and look across, and beyond it the trees and the water, and that is all. The house at Althorp received her, and it is worth saying what that meant in practice, because it was not sentiment. Her brother, who had inherited the earldom 5 years earlier at the age of 28, made the decision quickly, and under an intensity of public pressure that is hard now to imagine. A grave in a churchyard would have become a place of pilgrimage without end, and the small church at Great Brington, where 100 Spencers lie in the family vault, would have been overwhelmed within a week. The island was chosen because it could not be reached. It gave her, in death, the one thing she had not had in life, which was a place where nobody could follow her. She had never especially liked Althorp. She had found it cold as a child, and preferred the ordinary house in Norfolk. And in the end she came back to it, and it is where she is, and there is something in that which is either terrible or right, and I have never quite been able to decide which, and perhaps it is both. The house went on, because houses do. Her brother, the 9th Earl, opened it to visitors and restored it, and made an exhibition about his sister in the old stable block, which the family has since closed, and he wrote about the place and about their childhood. The estate is farmed. The pictures that remain hang on the walls. The Van Dykes are still there, and Henry Spencer, who died at Newbury, still looks down from his frame at whoever is passing, 380 years dead. The deer are in the park. The lime avenue stands, and a little way out into the water, on an island that nobody sets foot on, under the trees, is a daughter of that house. 500 years is a very long time. Try to hold the two ends of it together for a moment. At one end, a man on a horse in the rain, looking at sheep on a Warwickshire hillside, working out what the fleeces will fetch, saving his money, planning to buy a manor across the county line. At the other end, that same man's descendant, in the 17th generation, watched by 750 million people as she walks up the aisle of St. Paul's on her father's arm. It is the same family. It is the same blood, the same house, the same acres. Everything that girl was, and everything that was done to her rests, at the bottom of it, on the grass, and the rain, and the patient counting of animals on a hillside. And the strangest thing, and the thing I want to leave with you as this evening closes in, is that of all the Spencers across 5 centuries, all the earls and the duchesses, the turncoat and the bibliophile, the man who gave Nelson his fleet, and the man who carried the Reform Act, the only one the world remembers is the one who never wanted any of it, who was not clever or political or grand, who was frightened of the whole apparatus, and who was kind to people. The house is full of the portraits of the others. It is her they come to see. The applause is the thing I keep returning to, because it had no precedent, and nobody had planned it. Inside the abbey were the assembled institutions of a kingdom, the government and the church and the household and the diplomatic corps, and outside were 1 million ordinary people who had come up from everywhere to stand in a street. And the sound moved inward, From the parks to the doors to the west end of the nave and up the aisle, row by row, until people in mourning coats who had never applauded anything in a church in their lives were doing it too. Whatever it meant, and it has been argued over ever since, it was the country making a sound it had never made before, and it was not a sound of grief exactly, and it was not deference at all. And it is to what all of it means, and to the quiet of that park at the end of the day, that we turn now. What is a family? When it goes on for 500 years, it is not the same men and women. Nothing physical survives from Sir John the Grazier to the present day, except a few acres of Northamptonshire clay and a handful of letters and some paint on canvas. Every cell, every voice, every habit of thought has been replaced a dozen times over. The men and women in the picture gallery would not have understood one another's speech, let alone their politics or their manners or their God. Put the Grazier of 1508 in a room with the second Earl of Sunderland, and they would have found each other barely comprehensible. Put either of them in a room with a girl of 19 in 1981, and there would be nothing to say at all, and yet something continues, and it is not only the name, and it is not only the land, though those are the visible carriers of it. What continues, I think, is a project, handed on. Each generation receives an inheritance and a set of instructions, most of them unspoken, and the instructions amount to this: keep it, improve it if you can, hand it on. Do not be the one who loses it. And for 500 years, through civil war and revolution and depression, and 2 world wars, and the near extinction of the entire world these people were built for, no one of them was the one who lost it. Look at what they did to hold on. They sold the greatest library in Europe. They sold pictures they loved, and farms their tenants had worked for generations, and the London Palace, and thousands of acres. They let strangers walk through their rooms and buy postcards in their stables. Each generation gave away a piece of the body to keep the body alive, and each of them, I would guess, felt it as a small dishonour, and each of them did it anyway, because the alternative was to be the one who lost it, and they succeeded. That is the thing that ought to be said plainly. In the last century, something like 1,000 English country houses were pulled down. Whole families with older names and grander titles simply ceased, their houses demolished, their collections scattered at auction, their acres sold in lots, their names surviving only on a memorial in a village church. Althorp stands, the Lime Avenue stands, and a Spencer lives in it, as a Spencer has lived in it every year since 1508, which is longer than there has been a Protestant church in England, longer than there has been a United Kingdom, very nearly twice as long as there has been a United States. But I do not think the meaning of it is in the survival, and I do not think the family would say so either, whatever their ancestors thought, because the whole vast apparatus, the money and the marriages and the careful compounding across the generations, was pointed at the summit of English life, and it reached that summit exactly and precisely, and what it found there was a young woman who was profoundly unhappy. The project succeeded, and its greatest success was its greatest sorrow, and it is not possible to look at the two things separately, because they were the same thing, and consider the sheer arithmetic of endurance. 18 generations, give or take, something in the order of 520 harvests taken off the same ground. Every one of those years contained a family sitting down to dinner, and a household of servants going up and down the stairs, and children being born in the upstairs rooms and old men dying in them, and letters written and quarrels held and forgiven or not forgiven, and the whole immense unrecorded weight of ordinary daily living, of which we have preserved almost nothing but the names and the portraits and a few sentences. The history of any family is mostly lost. What survives is the accidental fragment, and we build our understanding out of it, and we should hold that understanding lightly. So perhaps this is what a family is. Not a fortune, and not a house, and not a name in a book of peerage. A long chain of people, each of them handed something they did not ask for, doing their best with it, misunderstanding one another, loving one another badly and sometimes well, and passing on to the next hands a thing slightly changed. The grazier counting his sheep, the boy Earl dead in a field at Newbury, who only wanted to go home, Sarah ferocious and grieving, writing her will, Georgiana in her plumes hunted by creditors, honest Jack longing for his cattle, the Red Earl changing his mind, and a girl weeping at night in a house on the edge of a royal park, who would one day sit on the beds of dying men and hold their hands, because she knew what it was to be lonely, and she could not bear that anyone else should be. None of them saw the whole of it. None of us ever does. That is what a family is, and it is what a country is, and it is very likely what a life is too. And now the light has gone entirely from the park, and the deer have moved down under the trees, and the house at the end of the avenue is dark except for a window or two. The lake is black and still. Out on the island the trees stand quiet over the water. 500 years of Spencers are sleeping in the vault beneath the little church, and the wind moves in the limes, and the great calm front of the house looks out across the grass as it has looked for 300 years and will look, with any luck, for 300 more. There is nothing to keep watch over. Everything that had to be carried has been carried and set down. One last thing before sleep takes you. Should you wish to slip away into another age some other night, there are plenty more of these journeys already made and simply sitting there, and you are under no obligation whatever. Subscribe if it suits you, and do not if it does not. Either way, I am glad you came tonight, and I hope the Spencers and their sheep and their lime trees follow you gently down into whatever you dream. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.